Hello dear viewers of my channel, I want to thank this guy for the donation, and these guys for a paid subscription to my channel, as well as I want to wish everyone a pleasant viewing experience. It was a very bright night outside as the moon lit up everything around. A man was looking at the reviews of people about his hospital, which he opened. He was completely broken because the reviews were just disgusting. People thought that in his hospital they are infected with coronavirus. For this reason, he was in debt and in a terrible moral state because of anger at all this teeniness. The man with all his might began to shout that it is not fair, because he is not to blame for the fact that people are sick with coronavirus. Suddenly the man stumbled, and a moment later he was deflected backwards, because of which at a great speed began to fall off the bridge, not realizing what was happening. The hero found himself in the water, unable to do anything. At this very moment he could not imagine that he would fall into another world, where he would be reborn as the heir of Lloyd, and become a divine healer. A moment later he received a notification from the system, which told him that for OZ points the hero could unlock different abilities, or summon different creatures. The guy started to open his eyes and saw the image of an unknown man in front of him. He assumed that this strange man pulled him out of the river. The guy instantly jumped out of bed thinking that it was too early to die and he needed to move on. With a shaky hand he grabbed a blanket thinking that it was better to live with debt than to die. The prince said that he would be more careful next time. Suddenly the hero realized that he was not in the hospital. He looked at the table on the court where gold jewelry, which were worth a lot of money. Suddenly the man began to cry and rejoice that his prince is alive. The protagonist did not understand what was happening and shyly said hello to the man. While asking who he was, the man did not understand how the prince cannot recognize him. Then with tears in his eyes he said that even if the prince does not remember him, he will continue to serve him. The protagonist did not understand what was going on, then asked for water. The doctor presented him an incredibly expensive jug of water. The guy was shocked that the jug had real diamonds and gold, but he started to drink. Suddenly the protagonist turned his attention to the mirror, in which he saw a complete stranger to himself, which immediately led him to shock, because of which he spilled the water. While the doctor wiped the prince, he thought about the fact that this is definitely not his face in the reflection. Suddenly he was numb on the spot. He remembered who this face belongs to, namely Rachel Audrey Magentano. It was a character from a novel that the man had read in the past. And now he had become a character from that novel. The prince turned to his healer and he immediately asked what the prince wanted to hear. The protagonist asked if the man could hit him in the face, and he could not believe what he had just heard. While Rachel did not wait for the man's help and with all his might swung his hand in the direction of his face, and then normal so warmed his palm on his face. The guy stopped moving for a while, then twisted from the pain caused by this blow. He covered his face with his hands. Then on his face there was amazement that he was reborn in the novel, became a crown prince named Rachel. Now the incredible amount of debts that tormented him before had no meaning, because now he was a prince in another world. The protagonist was overjoyed, for he was now rich and could live a life of prosperity. Suddenly he felt pain, and a moment later his body began to fall backwards. He fell on the bed unable to move. The healer was instantly worried about his young master. While Rachel himself did not understand what was happening, he felt incredibly weak throughout his body. He realized that his body in general was much weaker than other people's. Suddenly the protagonist realized something that made him dark. It turned out that he had become a minor character who had been bedridden since his youth, and at the age of 22 he died. Rachel asked his healer how old he was. When he heard his age, which was 21, he was shocked. He bit his lip at the realization of a very simple fact. He had only 1 year to live. Now the amazement on the hero's face was replaced by despair, because he expected to live his whole life in prosperity. But as a result he had only 1 year to live. Sitting on the couch Rachel thought about the fact that he as a prince was getting the best possible treatment. The protagonist thought that no treatment at all did not help, because of which he will die very soon. Now the protagonist has found a new goal for himself, namely to survive in his new body. Rachel went to his healer and asked him to bring needles, and he said that it didn't matter what size they were. The main thing was that the number of needles was as large as possible. A little while later it was night outside and Rachel was yawning. The guy was sitting on the bed thinking about the problem that had brought his body to such a state. He started to check his body with the help of the pulse measurement technique. He thought that his body was really in a bad state. The hero thought that his new life would be very difficult. Suddenly a healer entered the room and reported that he had brought all the needles that he had found in the house. As a result, The protagonist was faced with a huge number of needles that were not similar to each other, and the guy started to look at them and think. Rachel grabbed one of the needles thinking that it was a bit thick, and then began to warm it over a candle. The healer didn't understand what his master was going to do with these needles. While the protagonist admitted that he was going to pierce his body with them, the healer instantly fell to his knees in front of the protagonist. He began to beg the prince to stop and not to mutilate himself, because he still has to inherit the throne. The protagonist didn't understand his healer's worries at all, after which he asked the healer to stop crying. Rachel explained that everything he would do now would only positively affect his health. The boy heated the needle over the candle, asking the healer to trust him if nothing bad would happen after these procedures. The healer glared at his master, but unable to refuse, he simply turned his head away. The healer said he would trust the protagonist if it was the prince's will. The boy began to undress, asking the healer not to worry too much. The protagonist lay on his back, thinking that the first needle would be to normalize his breathing, because that's where his treatment should start. The protagonist knew perfectly well where the point he needed was, and then he prepared to pierce the point with the needle, and a moment later he finished the process. Suddenly a system appeared in front of Rahel's eyes, which reported that the lungs of the protagonist had taken the treatment very positively, and now they began to function somehow. The lungs awakened from their sleep and then danced, for now they were alive again. This treatment gave Rahel 100 ounce points, after which he froze in bewilderment in front of the system window. Rachel tried to touch the system notification, but it failed, while the doctor didn't understand what was going on and if the prince was okay. The protagonist kept trying to interact with the system window, which from a normal person looked as stupid as possible. The doctor cried with sadness. He started to believe that his beloved prince was starting to lose his mind, while the protagonist told the doctor that he hadn't made up his mind and asked him not to be dramatic. Rachel proceeded to inject himself with needles, whereupon he hit the right spot, which the system told him he had. The protagonist was covered in needles as he continued the procedure on his body. The guy wrinkled his face as the procedure was more painful than he had imagined, while the doctor quietly appealed to God, then passionately began to beg God to help his prince, because he went completely crazy. The man, seeing what the doctor does right in front of him, was so shocked that all emotions on his face disappeared. Then the guy silently turned around and began to look at the ceiling. The protagonist decided to just finish his work, not paying attention to the doctor. The system reported to the protagonist that thanks to the procedures the guy's lungs were in perfect condition. Rachel was angry because he didn't understand the metaphors that the system was using, and he was also annoyed that he was no longer getting points. Rachel stuck one of the needles in his finger. It was the last point, after which the lung treatment was successful, after which the system made an analogy of the main character's lungs tap dancing. The imaginary lungs were dancing on the stage. They continued their crazy dance, while the organ that was responsible for defecation, namely the intestines, tried to continue their sleep, but under such noise from the lungs it was not easy to fall asleep, and the system announced that the intestines were also awake, after which the intestines declared that the lungs were doing exactly the wrong thing, and began to shout that they could not forget about him. After that, a new round of dancing started with the intestines. Thanks to all this, the main character got another 300 XP. Rachel thought that now his organs are in a slightly better position. Suddenly the system told that the main character can buy skills for points, and the imagination of the guy immediately appeared images of mages and swordsmen using aura. The guy instantly clicked on the button to see the available skills, and then a window appeared in front of the protagonist, in which there were as many as 10 skills, 9 of which were related to medicine and 1 Azrahan core technique. Rachel thought about the fact that the skills were related to what he was doing at work. He thought about the fact that the beginning of any treatment is a diagnosis, because without it you cannot cure anything. It was with these thoughts that the protagonist chose the first ability, namely reading the pulse. Rachel decided to immediately test this skill on himself, after which the skill instantly began to act and scan the general state of health of the protagonist. It turned out that the condition of the protagonist was quite deplorable and he had only 91 days to live. This information is not very happy Rahel. He thought that at this rate he will not even have time to enjoy the new world. The hero immediately began another method using needles. After some time he stuck the last needle in his finger, and in front of him there was a window system, which reported that the life expectancy of the prince increased by a day. This shocked the protagonist because he did not expect that life expectancy can be increased. The guy immediately grabbed the needle because he was going to do the same trick, and a moment later spurts of blood began to burst out of his mouth. It was because he used the acupuncture power too often, while the doctor seemed to have lost consciousness. The protagonist realized that for such treatment the patient's body should be in a more or less normal state to withstand the strain on the nervous system, and now the prince's body, if to put it in the language of gamers, was on the minimum health scale. The prince began to think that if he could perform this procedure once every 3 days, he could live a month longer. He also thought that it wasn't enough, and he definitely knew a method that could help. The protagonist looked confident, for he thought that something he could eat would definitely help him. He decided that the potions would help him in his situation. While the healer didn't understand what his prince was thinking, the protagonist looked in the man's direction and said that he had a request for the healer. The protagonist asked if they had any more effective herbs in their storehouse. The healer didn't understand what kind of herbs they were talking about, while the protagonist explained that he meant poisonous plants. The doctor said that they had them, but he didn't understand why the hero needed them. While the prince asked if they had aconite root, the doctor said that they did have such a plant, although they were not in the main palace. Rachel was glad that the plant he needed was in this place and immediately ordered the root to be brought. The doctor did not understand why the prince needed the poison, while Rachel smiled with all his teeth and then declared that he would eat the poisonous plant. This shocked the doctor, who had been fighting for the prince's life until now, while the protagonist himself, smiling terribly, ordered to carry the plant. Sometime later it was night outside. While the doctor fell on his knees begging the prince not to do that, he is a doctor and can't poison his prince. The protagonist said it was part of his treatment and that the doctor should stop whining and bring the right plant. The doctor couldn't argue with the prince and silently cried, hoping that his master would change his mind. The doctor continued to cry even after the protagonist said that if he didn't bring the plant in 5 minutes, he would get hit on the head. The protagonist sighed, thinking that he couldn't get what he wanted by force, then asked the doctor if he knew that the root was poisonous, and the doctor said that yes, he also knew that the root was often used to make poisons. The protagonist began to say that of the 2 parts of the root he wanted to eat the smaller one, and the doctor instantly said that the effect of such a substance would be instant cardiac arrest. The protagonist smilingly said that the doctor was right, and then with a confident look said that he knew how to control the poison and neutralize its harmful properties. The hero declared that he could make a cure from this plant. The doctor could not believe what he was hearing, namely that the prince was going to turn the poison into medicine. The prince explained that the process by which this would be possible is called detoxification. Such words still didn't convince the doctor, which made the prince's eyes go blank. But the doctor stated that he would always help the prince, and said that he would bring the root of the plant. The protagonist was left alone in the room while the doctor moved down the hallway with thoughts of Rahel's body getting weaker and weaker every day. The doctor went into the pantry thinking that he was getting desperate because nothing was working. He looked for the right plant thinking that maybe the prince's way would work. Looking at the right ingredient, the doctor realized a simple fact. He was determined that after the detoxification process he would be the first to eat the medicine to make sure it was safe. A short while later, the prince watched in amazement as the medicine was prepared. The medicine was on the table, bubbling and boiling, while the doctor noticed that the decoction had a very strange smell, and the hero was surprised that the doctor still does not believe that this liquid is completely safe. The doctor was very frightened because his prince was brewing some kind of poison right now. The doctor immediately started begging the protagonist to stop and not to continue what he was doing, while Rachel decided to scare the doctor and offered him to be the first to try the potion. Suddenly the doctor was not frightened and just said that the guy's idea was great. This shocked the protagonist, because this was definitely not the reaction he expected to see. The guy silently kept looking at the doctor. The protagonist remembered that in the novel this doctor was very loyal, even though he was a saint of the saints. In the novel, this holy doctor was blamed for the prince's death and eventually executed, but now he was silently looking at a pot filled with poison. Rachel realized that this is an incredibly sincere man, who for his loyalty definitely deserves a good life. Suddenly the protagonist looked at the pot and thought about it, and then with a mad look decided that he would not share such a great medicine with the doctor, after which the protagonist covered the pot with gauze. He also strained the decoction. The doctor asked if he could start drinking this strange remedy. The protagonist said that the doctor should wait until it cooled down completely before drinking it. The doctor was surprised that the protagonist so confidently says this and did not understand how the guy has such knowledge in medicine. The protagonist didn't know what to answer, and then started to talk nonsense about a magician who appeared to him in a dream and told him the secret of this recipe. The doctor, with obvious disbelief, stated that he believed the protagonist. The doctor stated that the medicine was too suspicious, while the prince himself turned towards the potion and instantly pulled his hand to the bowl. The boy greedily began to drink what he had just brewed, which shocked the doctor, because the protagonist in a moment managed to drain the entire bowl of this potion to the bottom. The protagonist wiped his mouth, then turned towards the doctor and told him that he drank it all down. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of the main character's eyes. The guy's heart began to behave strangely, which made him think that something was coming. Suddenly, the system told that thanks to a perfectly prepared potion, the protagonist was able to improve his condition a little, as well as unlock the energy of the core Azrahan. This technique was created by a legendary master and knight known as Xavier, as well as a legendary aristocrat named Lloyd. This technique was transferred only to a direct descendant of the royal family, and since he is a prince, he must have learned about this technique in his youth. The protagonist was able to unlock the Azrahan Stage 1 core energy skill. Now a ring of mana began to appear near his heart. It continued to swirl near the protagonist's heart, and it granted life energy that began to circulate throughout the prince's body. Rachel was able to feel the mana perfectly, marveling at this unusual feeling. The protagonist was overjoyed because it was very cool. As a friend, the plate he was holding fell to the ground and shattered, and the prince grabbed his heart, which began to hurt a lot. He began to feel as if his heart was going to burst, because of what the guy felt just disgusting. The doctor was very worried about his lord. It seemed he had panic and did not know what to do, while in front of the protagonist appeared a system window, which told him that the mana circle is putting too much pressure on the mana. The protagonist realized that the size of his heart didn't fit the size of the mana circle. He realized that the prince didn't have time to train his mana circle as he had been sick since he was a kid. And it was at this point that the mana ring shrunk the prince's heart like a ring that didn't fit. The boy held onto his chest, thinking that he had only one way out. He began to control the flow of his mana, then went to his subconscious mind, knowing perfectly well that he was unable to reduce the size of his heart. The guy firmly decided to increase the size of the magic circle. Then he faced his heart, which was shrinking with the magic circle. The protagonist began to run towards the heart, then grabbed the magic circle with all his might, and began to pull with all his might, trying to stretch the mana circle. The guy made the mana circle spin at a tremendous speed. The prince felt that at any second he could lose consciousness, but remembering the past in which, because of some rumor, he found himself in a terrible situation. Yes, so much so that he began to go bald. A huge amount of debts that can't be paid off for the rest of his life. The guy was out of his mind with anger, remembering how he lost his own house in his past life. The guy kept pulling the mana ring. He tried his best, because this process was not easy, but he grasped the circle tighter, then took a step and with all his might untwisted the mana circle, shouting that when he kept the business in Korea he suffered many times more. The mana circle finally stopped pressing on the protagonist's heart, while in reality his body began to fall. The doctor instantly tried to bring the prince to his senses, and the protagonist seemed to physically come to normal. Suddenly, inside the main character's body, the organs announced that their king had arrived. The men were carrying a heavy wagon with difficulty. Then the doors of the wagon opened, and a frail man came out of it, who instantly stood in a strange pose, then began to glow very brightly and transform, and as a result, the heart began to look very good. The intestines greeted their boss, while the lungs laughed that the heart was shabby. The heart said hello to the organs, while the protagonist, watching this, apologized that his body was so shabby. Suddenly, the prince's attention was drawn to a system window that told him that he had received an inventory that had a capacity of 1 liter, which caused an instant parallels for the hero with the game. Suddenly, Rahel was on his feet, which startled his doctor, who asked what the man wanted to ask him. The doctor assumed that the terrible pain was a side effect of the medicine, while Rahel said that he had just choked. The prince started to show where the medicine was stuck. Then, looking at the mug, the doctor said that it looked as if the prince was really in danger and he wished he had drank the medicine first. The protagonist was surprised that the doctor wanted to drink the poison so badly, and then promised to give the poison next time, which made the doctor nervous because he didn't mean it. The prince started to leave, saying that the doctor should clean up. But before he left, Rachel turned to the doctor and thanked him profusely, which shocked the doctor, who didn't expect to hear such a thing from the prince. The protagonist began to go under the doctor's words that maybe the poison had a negative effect on the prince, because he had never said that before. The protagonist was very enthusiastic and went forward. He thought that the skill he had just gotten was something incredible. A while later, the guy began his pondering. His ability allowed him to store materials mixed with mana, and there were 10 liters in each slot. The protagonist realized that the materials from the storage could be absorbed, and that he would need to eat something to replenish the storage. The guy started to move towards the room, then he noticed a full jug of water that was on the table. Rachel thought about the fact that the water would be perfect for the experiment. The protagonist thought about the term medium lethal dosage, namely that it is a dosage that can kill 50% of the test subjects. The protagonist thought about the fact that his chance of dying was 50%, and even if he survived, he might turn into a vegetable. The guy realized that with his weight, the lethal dose of water was 4 liters. Rachel picked up the jug of water and was amazed at how heavy it was. The boy began to greedily consume the liquid from the jug, and then thought about putting away the water he was drinking right now. Suddenly the system showed that a whole liter of water was accumulated. Rachel was surprised because he didn't feel that he was drunk. After a while, 4 empty vessels stood in front of the guy. He was amazed that just now he drank 10 liters and didn't feel anything at all. After the protagonist absorbed 100 grams of water from the storage, and immediately felt that his thirst was gone, he made an analogy with a camel, which also stores liquids, and then uses them to support the body. The protagonist decided that now it was the turn of the potion, but he also understood that he could not drink the remaining water at once, because then he would surely die. The guy did not understand what to do. As suddenly an idea appeared in his head, he began to move towards the empty jug, and then prepared to use his core, because it is designed to release and amplify mana. The protagonist wanted to try to use these abilities. Then he instantly started the process of mana amplification and release, and a ball of water appeared in the hand of the protagonist. Then he began to think about pouring this water into the jug, as suddenly a clot of water at great speed flew towards the jug, then instantly smashed this vessel with tremendous force. This shocked the guy, who certainly did not expect such a thing. He did not understand how this could happen. In front of him was a broken container and spilled water. He imagined how this liquid slowly flowed into the vessel, and eventually his mana turned into a water cannon, while the guards at a great speed ran towards the bedroom of the protagonist, because from there was heard a noise. They instantly rushed in worried about the prince. The doctor instantly asked if everything was all right with Rahel. The soldier assumed that the prince was attacked, and he instantly explained that it was not. The protagonist didn't know how to explain what had just happened to these people. The prince just stood there like a fool, unable to come up with a plausible explanation, and then he started talking nonsense about being angry and smashing a jug on the table. The doctor and the guard looked at each other, while Rachel hoped that his stupid words could quench the curiosity of these people. The knight simply bowed and asked if the prince had hurt himself, and the boy said he had just scratched his leg a little, wondering if they actually believed him. The knight asked the doctor to escort the prince to the second bedroom, after which the doctor carried the protagonist on his back. Sometime later Rachel was lying in bed while the doctor asked him to rest well. The prince said that the doctor should also rest well. Then he started thinking about what happened the moment he used the mana. At that very moment, a huge amount of mana was released from the mana circle. After amplifying it, it burst out in a flash. The guy thought that his mana was full of energy. In the end, the prince decided to just sleep until he had time to cause more trouble, and in the future to experiment but carefully. At that time, in the castle of the king of this state, whose name was Estelian Testarossa Magentano, and now he was sitting on the throne. The man reported to the emperor that the crown prince began to harm himself with needles and poison. This caused an ambiguous reaction of the emperor. He was out of his mind with anger because he did not understand what his son, who is also the crown prince, was doing. The prince and the doctor watched as a huge bowl of root was boiled. The preparation was almost finished, and sometime later the protagonist rejoiced that finally the medicine was ready. The prince instantly asked the doctor to leave the room for a while, but he didn't quite understand why he needed to. The protagonist understood that if the doctor saw him drinking 10 liters of medicine, he would faint. Rachel said that the doctor only needed to leave the room for a while, because he had something to do. The doctor asked with distrust in his eyes if the prince was going to drink the potion again. Then they talked about the fact that last time the protagonist was in pain after drinking the potion. The doctor said that he was very worried because this time the prince had prepared a really large amount of the potion. The protagonist said that it was necessary for the experiment, and he would not drink much. Just the stuffy doctor believed his master. He thought that only fools could drink all this potion, and they all laughed, while in the end only the doctor continued to laugh under the gaze of the prince. The protagonist instantly kicked the doctor out of the room, so fast that he reacted the moment the prince closed the doors. Rahel went to the huge amount of medicine, then grabbed the heavy pot, then greedily began to empty all the contents of this container. The guy absorbed the medicine in liters until it was over and filled the entire slot in his body. The guy felt great, as for a man who just drank 10 liters of medicine. After a while, the protagonist released the medicine a little at a time. He did it even when he was sitting on the toilet, and even when he was lying in bed he continued to release the medicine a little at a time. For a while, all the organs were delighted with the amount of medicine, and gave HP points to the prince, but sometime later the protagonist noticed that his life expectancy did not increase, while inside his body the heart was lying on the couch, and asked the intestines what would be for dinner today. The intestines enthusiastically said that they would be having a potluck lunch. The heart grudgingly asked what they would eat the next day, but the answer did not change. The intestines said that they would continue to eat this broth. The system reported to the protagonist that his organs were fed up with the broth. A while later the prince sat at the table before eating, then ate a spoonful of soup, which instantly increased his life by 50 days, and now his lifespan was 133 days. The prince was overjoyed. He even jumped up from his chair and screamed, which scared the maid, who did not expect the prince to jump up from his seat and start screaming. Because of the fright, she broke the dishes she was holding. The hero instantly apologized for scaring the poor girl. She in turn began to beg for forgiveness for breaking the dishes. The poor girl was shaking with fear. She seemed very afraid. Rachel said it was all right and asked if the girl was hurt, but she kept begging for forgiveness and begged not to be whipped. The protagonist was shocked by such words and asked if he had done such a thing before. She said that it had not happened. This made the protagonist calm down, but suddenly he heard the girl say that the prince did not personally punish her, which caused a storm of emotions in the guy. The prince immediately inquired why he punished her so cruelly, and she confessed that she had spilled a drop of water on the guy's sleeve. The image of the prince, who was a real monster, immediately appeared in the hero's mind. The guy sat down on the bed. He was completely defeated and said that the girl would not get punished and could pass go. The girl was very happy that she would not be beaten and thanked the prince for his kindness. The protagonist thought about the fact that the girl's face reminded him of the face of a person who had escaped from imprisonment. Rachel turned to her doctor, and he arrived on the spot immediately, wondering what his master wanted from him, and the hero asked him to tell how he had behaved before, for now his memory was foggy. The doctor was about to begin his story, but suddenly the prince interrupted him and said that if the doctor began to flatter, he would drink all the poison before his eyes. The doctor could not flatter now, and then she began her long story about how the prince had behaved in the past. It turned out that in the past the prince was a real tyrant who treated his servants terribly, which shocked the protagonist, who was not such a person at all. Now it was clear to Rahel why everyone believed in his stupid excuses. The prince turned to his doctor with a question, namely why the doctor was not afraid of him, and assumed that the doctor had suffered the most in the past. The doctor started talking about just trusting the protagonist. The doctor, with a smile on his face, started talking about how he knows what the prince is really like. In the distant past it was raining very hard in this place. The young doctor was running around looking for someone. Suddenly he found what he was looking for. It was a little prince who was sitting in the rain holding something in his hands. It turned out to be a little duck that the prince was warming with his body. This made the young doctor smile, and then the doctor said that by curing the prince's illness, he was sure that the prince would become himself. He also remembered how the prince had thanked him and that his faith was beginning to be realized. Rachel asked if the doctor liked his changes, and he answered without hesitation that he did. Then the protagonist ordered the doctor to eat one sweet, which was the doctor's reward. The prince swore to himself that he would never allow the execution of this beautiful man. He would do anything to survive in this world. Suddenly someone started knocking on the door, and then a man burst into the room, who immediately turned to the prince. He began to say that the prince was called to him by their king, which really surprised the protagonist, who did not expect it. The weather was beautiful outside. While the protagonist dressed as a real prince and moved around the castle, it seems that Rachel was preparing for the worst, because he didn't know what the king needed from him. The prince formally greeted his king, while the emperor himself scrutinized his own son. Suddenly the emperor's face changed. He seemed to notice something strange, namely the Azrahan core technique that the frail prince appeared to have. While the protagonist's body began to shake, this caused irritation on the emperor's face, who thought that the prince was agitated at his presence, when in fact the protagonist was sick of this pose and hoped that the king would finish soon so that he could finally get up. The emperor asked if the prince was happy with his life in the side palace, and he instantly replied that he was. The emperor asked his son what he was doing with the needles, because he was told that the boy was harming himself and poisoning himself. The protagonist instantly decided to say that he wasn't doing anything wrong, but the emperor interrupted his son, calling Rahel a fool who wasn't worthy of his title of crown prince. The emperor declared that his son is a prince and he should never lose his dignity. Rachel sat silently and did not know how to answer the emperor, after which the emperor stated that because of his health the prince simply could not bear the weight of the crown, after which he shocked the hero by saying that he should make a wise decision. Watching his father, he understood the emperor's ulterior motives. While the emperor decided to stop speaking in innuendo, he said in all seriousness that Rahel should give up his position as crown prince and give it to his brother. The protagonist didn't expect such a thing. He thought the dialogue would be about something else. Suddenly silence dispelled the voice of the protagonist, who with full confidence on his face refused the emperor's proposal. The emperor instantly clenched his hand in anger, then jumped up from his seat in incomprehension at how the prince dared to disobey the emperor's order. While the protagonist said that this was how he was going to refuse, he began to think that the emperor did not need the prince's consent to hand over the throne to his brother. The protagonist thought that the king wanted to use the voluntary transfer of the crown to make it appear that he had a son who had given his place to his brother. The protagonist thought with a smirk on his face that even though he was weak now, he would never go down without a fight. The king looked with anger at his son, thinking that the prince is just worried. The emperor started to approach the guy with words that the prince does not appreciate his concern. The emperor asked if the prince would be calm when he brought shame on the imperial family and him personally. The protagonist didn't really care about the title. In fact, he would be happy to hand the title over to anyone and enjoy life, but if he did that the country would go to hell, all because of the second prince. Even though the second prince was diligent and capable, there would soon be an era of chaos. The protagonist believed that the second prince was too bad a ruler for the hardships that awaited the empire next. The protagonist began to rise to his feet, saying that although he was physically weak, he had not lost his intelligence and wisdom. He said that the title itself was not important to him, but the prosperity of the empire was important to him. The emperor thought that these were very good words, while the prince said that these were not just good words, and then he said that he wanted to make a proposal to the emperor. The protagonist asked for a chance to show the emperor who could better handle the burden of the crown. A while later, the sun was shining brightly outside. The doctor asked his master why the emperor had summoned him, but the prince said that nothing was wrong, because the emperor only wanted him to pass the title to his brother. The doctor was shocked by the information he had just heard. The prince asked his physician not to worry because, after all, he had rejected the emperor's offer. Prince, with a smile on his face, told how he had proposed a duel with his brother. The prince immediately changed his face when he saw the doctor's reaction and started packing his things, as he thought they would be kicked out soon. While the emperor stood in front of the window thinking about something. He was thinking about what the prince had said, namely that he wanted a chance to prove that he was worthy of the title. The emperor was surprised that his son had such a side, and mentally agreed to give him that chance, while the prince himself fought with his healer to keep him from packing. A while later the weather was beautiful outside. Huge flags were flying in the wind. The spectator stands were filled with a huge number of people. Even the king himself was sitting in anticipation of the upcoming duel between the brothers. The boys entered the arena and the hero was silently warming up under the gazes of the huge number of people. The girls were crazy about the protagonist's brother and assumed that his victory would be incredible, while the brother began to move towards the protagonist, who was now warming up his body for the upcoming battle. The second prince stated that Rahel didn't have to duel. He seemed to be worried about his brother. He stated that the outcome was already clear and he did not want to maim his brother. The protagonist was well aware that his brother wanted to say that he would definitely win. The second prince said that the emperor had said that it was Rachel who had suggested the duel. Suddenly he said that it was done to make the second prince's right to the throne more legitimate, which logically caused misunderstanding in the protagonist. His brother began to say that Rahel didn't need to ruin his health for him, because it wasn't right. The protagonist just silently smiled through his teeth, believing that both the emperor and his brother were wrong. The protagonist asked the doctor to give him the shield, after which he put the heavy git on the ground. All the onlookers didn't understand what it was, while even the emperor didn't understand what it was. His brother was similarly shocked at the sight of this weapon. While the protagonist himself said with a confident expression that he was not going to lose this battle, the prince seemed to be completely confident in his victory even though he had an incredibly weak body. The city lived its life while the protagonist stood in the arena, ready for battle with people commenting that he didn't stand a chance. The doctor watched the protagonist standing with his shield. The man seemed to be thinking about something when he heard the words that the prince didn't stand a chance. A little while earlier the protagonist was preparing himself for the upcoming battle. The doctor was trying to dissuade his master because it was very dangerous. The doctor was trying to say that he believed that the prince would win, but Rachel knew that the man was lying. The doctor only watched the protagonist who said that he only had to block 3 of his opponent's blows. He said that if he succeeded he would win the battle for sure. The doctor began to pray for his master. He hoped with all his heart that he would come out of this confrontation unscathed, while the prince himself was filled with faith in his own strength. The king began his speech. He said that this battle would decide which of the brothers was more suitable for the role of king. All the spectators listened attentively to the rules announced by the king. It turned out the rule was that the protagonist is enough to last 5 minutes to win the duel. If he could not hold out, the victory would be given to the second prince. After these words, the emperor said that the guys would start the duel, and they stood in front of each other, looking carefully into each other's eyes. The brothers stood in the center of a huge crowd of people who held their breath in anticipation of the upcoming fight. Suddenly, the protagonist threw away his sword right after the start, which instantly displeased the emperor, who thought that he would at least resist. The people also thought it was a horrible sight, as the prince just seemed to have surrendered. The second prince continued to stand in front of the hero, holding his sword tightly. He assumed that his brother was surrendering, happy that he wouldn't have to point his sword at a sick man. But he also didn't believe that the hero dared to surrender in front of so many people. The prince didn't know what to do in this situation, while Rachel grabbed the handles on his shield, then placed it firmly in front of him. The prince assumed that his brother had simply adopted a defensive tactic and would try to hold out for 5 minutes. A smile appeared on his opponent's face, after which his body was covered in aura, and it seemed like he was preparing for a strong attack. The enemy opened his eyes, and then instantly leaped out of his seat, and at a great speed was right in front of the protagonist, who prepared to parry the blow. The king thought that the shield would not be able to withstand the power that the second prince put into this blow, but suddenly the protagonist also used his mana, and blocked the prince's blow. The second prince hoped that his brother would not faint, but fall to his knee in defeat, while the protagonist remained firmly on his feet, smiling slyly. The opponent couldn't believe his own eyes. His squishy brother had just blocked a full-force punch. The other people were just as shocked at what they had just seen. They couldn't believe that the prince had just blocked his brother's punch. The king began to look carefully at the battlefield. He saw the aura that the protagonist was releasing, and he knew it was no accident. The protagonist looked confidently towards his opponent, waiting for another lunge. The second prince realized that this was no accident, and then he clenched his teeth and grasped his sword just as tightly. Then with all his might he struck the protagonist with fury, who was once again able to block even such a heavy blow with his shield. The aura of the second prince put a huge amount of pressure on the hero, which made it very hard for him to hold the blow, while the second prince was about to blow his brother away. The force of the blow was enough to throw the protagonist a great distance away, a sight that made the doctor worry about Rachel even more. While the protagonist landed on the ground thinking that his body was starting to fail, even his head was starting to spin. The hand he was holding his shield with started to feel numb and shaky, but he wasn't going to give up because he had been a police officer in the past, and that was nothing compared to what he had experienced. The protagonist began to approach his brother at a great speed, while shielding himself with his shield. The enemy struck again, which the protagonist was able to parry, after which the second prince attacked again, but to no avail. The protagonist began to smile, thinking that what he was going to use would be effective. The second prince began to say that he didn't know what his brother was up to. Then they simultaneously said that this was definitely the end of their fight. Then the opponent jumped and was at a great height above the protagonist, who was preparing to take the blow. The enemy struck with his sword. It turns out that the protagonist had trained his lower body hard for this moment. He had specially ordered this shield from a blacksmith, and later began to pour a huge amount of alcohol into himself. He smiled, anticipating how this foul mana would get into his brother's body. The protagonist started releasing this alcohol with 0.2 liters while they stood in front of each other. Suddenly, the opponent's legs began to squint. This caused the audience to not understand what was happening, and the king himself did not understand what just happened. While the second prince began to hiccup industriously from the amount of alcohol he had just received through mana. They stood at a sufficient distance from each other. The enemy began to retreat back. He did not understand what was happening to him, while the protagonist was glad that the information from the novel was true, because his brother gets drunk very quickly. It turned out that the explosive cocktail he used on his brother contains 20 kinds of strong alcohol. The enemy did not realize what had just penetrated his body. It seemed he was completely lost because of the alcohol in his blood. He was still thinking about the outcome and was going to finish Rahel as soon as possible. He thought that when he won he would get his father's recognition. He would be applauded by thousands of citizens and the place of the prince's crown would be his. Looking at the protagonist, he thought that if he won, everyone would be better off, even Rahel himself. The enemy began to mutter something in his ear, and later with full confidence stated that he had to win, because there could be no other option. The enemy launched a fierce attack on the protagonist, who immediately used his shield, wondering if the second prince could resist the explosive cocktail. The enemy raised his sword and charged it with mana, preparing to strike. Then they clashed again with sword and shield, under the hero's thoughts of adding some cocktail, and he added 100 grams of this explosive mixture. He watched how his brother would behave. While the look of his opponent changed dramatically, he found himself in an unfamiliar place. He did not understand what was happening now, while the heart of the protagonist began to stir the cocktail. Then put this mixture right in front of the prince. The heart pointed in the direction saying that the gentleman treated this young man. It turned out to be the protagonist, who was sitting next to his brother. He started to turn around towards his opponent, after which he said a toast, namely to drink to his brother's health. The opponent was shocked that he started to hallucinate strangely, while the protagonist threw away his shield. Then he began to absorb a huge amount of air, thinking that now everything will be over. As the protagonist prepared to attack, his mana began to concentrate in his hand, and Rahel struck his brother directly, causing him to cough in pain, and because of the force of the blow the protagonist took, he began to fly with great speed, and eventually fell to the ground, leaving a cloud of smoke behind him. This shocked absolutely every spectator in the arena. Even the nobles could not believe their own eyes. And what's more, the emperor himself looked at it all with his mouth open, not believing what had just happened. The protagonist stood smiling, for he had just won his duel. There was silence for a while. The emperor noticed that the protagonist had used Azrahan's core technique. Looking at the protagonist, he was confident, despite the fact that there was a huge amount of other people's energies around, and even though they were far away from each other, he could feel the response of the protagonist's circle perfectly. A short while later, the enemy opened his eyes, and then instantly jumped up from his seat while Rachel massaged his legs. The second prince didn't understand what was happening now, while Rachel told him to be quiet, for he was now cleansing his brother's body of the foul mana. The second prince didn't understand how Rachel was able to master the technique, and he thought that there was nothing unusual about it. The second prince looked towards his blade, then realized that he had just lost a duel to his ailing brother. It appeared that Rachel had injured his forehead. His brother was worried, while the prince himself said that he had most likely been injured when he blocked his brother's blows. The second prince looked at his brother, thinking that Rachel had given his best during their fight. He thought about the fact that Rachel had made the most of his abilities, and thought about how shameful he had been about the fight, as he had originally thought he would win. The second prince realized that he had been overconfident. The protagonist asked how his brother was feeling, and he said he was ashamed. Rachel said that he didn't mean that, but his physical condition. His brother confessed that he was feeling much better, which made the protagonist proud of his skills. The second prince got down on one knee, then officially admitted his defeat in the fight with Rahel. This kind of surprised the protagonist a bit, while the second prince continued to stand on one knee in front of him. The audience didn't know how to react, but after a while all the people started cheering and rejoicing. The protagonist stood for a while, then raised his hands as a sign that he was able to handle this battle. The doctor was crying with happiness because his master was able to win, while in front of Rahel's eyes a system appeared, which told him that the hero now received a payment for treatment, namely 1/2000th of the added life expectancy of the patient, from which Rahel was simply delighted. But as soon as the protagonist found out that he had increased his brother's life by only half a day, and that he would get nothing from it, since the minimum to get it was 1 day, he was disappointed. The protagonist thought that now every time he treats patients, he will not only increase their life expectancy, but also his own. Rachel was very happy with what he had gotten, because no matter how much medicine he drank, it would end up being the same as trying to fill a leaky vessel. The boy began to smile, thinking that everything would change from now on. Suddenly the hero's thoughts were interrupted by the emperor, who asked why the guy is silent. It turned out the emperor asked whether the protagonist used the Azrahan core in battle, and he immediately said that it was so. The king immediately began to ask how the guy had mastered it, and he said that he himself has not yet fully understood how it happened. The king looked at his son with anger, thinking that he didn't understand him. The protagonist said that he really didn't understand the king, thinking that he just couldn't tell him about the needle cure. The emperor began to talk about the fact that when the prince was born, he had put Azrahan's core into his heart with his own hands. The hero said that he was honored, while the emperor went on to say that because of his weak body, the hero could not use the power. Rachel apologized to the emperor, while he was surprised that at the most important moment the boy was still able to use his power. The hero thanked the emperor, who was angry because all his work had gone wrong. The protagonist apologized to the emperor without emotion on his face, not understanding whether the man was scolding him or praising him. The emperor turned around and said that he would fulfill his promise to leave the title to the protagonist. And then the emperor turned to the prince and said that he would continue to watch him. The protagonist listened as his father talked about how he would keep a close eye on whether he could handle the burden he would receive. Rachel clenched his fists and began to be silent for a while, which displeased the emperor, who asked why the prince was silent. The protagonist began to talk about his father's recent lack of movement, and then began to say that he should move more to strengthen his muscles. Eventually, standing right in front of the emperor, he said that it was time for him to quit smoking and eat more vegetables. The emperor did not realize who was such a hero to give him advice, while Rachel himself confidently declared that he had said this with the sincerest of intentions. A short time later, in the forest, the king was traveling on his carriage, complaining at the top of his voice that his son's response to the advice was some hypocritical request. The emperor was angry that the prince never answered the question about the power he used in battle. The emperor began to stomp his foot in the hearing, scolding his son for using the power so thoughtlessly, for it could have damaged his body. The emperor began to stare at one point, thinking about how desperate his son was. He remembered that the prince had lost his mother at birth and was constantly sick, and although he was looking forward to seeing something from the protagonist, he was always disappointed. However, remembering the moment when Rachel sparred with the second prince, he realized that now a glimmer of hope made his heart shudder again. As the protagonist rode the cart, he thought about the fact that the current emperor, like his father in the real world, would also have a stroke. The night his father died, he skipped school and went out for fun, and when he got the call, he found his father dead. At that time, the emperor would also die of a stroke, right after Rachel's death. The protagonist was determined not to let this happen. He wanted the emperor to live on, and he didn't want to live through the situation of his father dying again. Suddenly, the doctor began to sob and turned to Rachel, which frightened the prince. The doctor started begging the protagonist to ask why he was crying. The prince decided to fulfill such a strange request and asked why the doctor was crying, and he confessed that he was incredibly touched. He began to tell how difficult it was for the prince, while the guy pulled away from the doctor with the words that he needed to rest, because the next day he had a lot of things to do. The doctor didn't understand what kind of business the prince could have, while the prince was going to meet someone. Sometime later, the protagonist and the doctor were sitting in one of the best restaurants in the capital. The doctor confessed that he was a regular customer at this place and was surprised that the prince had decided to change his clothes, which was really strange because now he looked like a completely different person. After a while, the waiter came out and then came to the table and started taking the order. The protagonist also said that they would bring wine and that he would eat in this place until sunrise, and asked if it would be a problem. The waiter instantly asked the guys to follow him, and the protagonist got up from his chair while the doctor didn't understand anything. The doctor asked what was going on while the prince asked the man to silently follow him, and he would find out for himself. The waiter said that the guys would have to go down the stairs. The doctor was surprised that this restaurant was such a strange place, and the doctor looked at the main character and didn't understand how he knew all this. While Rachel was happy that everything was exactly as it was in the novel. The doctor asked why they were here and what this place was, while the protagonist said that he had come to this place to collect a lot of payment for the treatment. They continued on their way, after which Rachel asked if the doctor had heard of Damien, but he had heard nothing of the sort. The protagonist opened the gate, after which they found themselves on a balcony in some large-scale place, where spectators were placing bets on the warriors who were fighting below. Inspecting the ghastly place, the doctor wondered what it was, while the prince stated that it was just a secret place, whereupon the lad with a glance started looking for the right person. The doctor looked towards a tough-looking man who looked like a real warrior and assumed it was Damien. The doctor said he looked very strong, while the prince said he was the wrong man. Then an unknown man started to enter the arena. He kept moving towards the battle site. Then the prince immediately stated that the man they were looking for was now entering the arena. The man looked very confident and fresh blood was dripping from his blade. Turned out that this man was the real protagonist of this novel, whose name was Damien Cayenne. The real protagonist of the story was standing opposite his creepy man, when suddenly the judge told the man to leave the arena, because he had finished his battle. The referee began to announce that their main fight today was about to take place, where on one side of the arena was an incredibly talented swordsman who made his debut in this place when he was only 17 years old, and in just 3 months was able to become the champion, defeating every single one of his opponents. While this talented man's opponent was something whose eyes glowed in the darkness. A huge creature began to enter the arena. It looked incredibly creepy, and at the same time it looked incredibly strong. The monster screamed with great force, making even the air around it shudder. The protagonist was surprised that Damien's opponent was the very real troll. It was definitely a serious opponent. The doctor grabbed his master and turned to him. He was shaking with fear and asked where the prince had brought him. For this was the place where humans and trolls collide. While the monster headed for a fierce attack and very swiftly shortened the distance between them. While the man carelessly turned his foot while the monster's fist was already right in front of his face, and it was only milliseconds away from hitting him. The monster threw a powerful punch that shattered the concrete floor, but still missed the man. This seemed to hurt the monster, who was confident that he could end the battle with one attack, and then the enemy instantly struck again, but the man again dodged very easily. The monster decided to grab the man by the shoulder, but suddenly the man and this time was able to break free from the seemingly hopeless situation. The guy looked carefully at his opponent monster, then grabbed his blade and began to pull it out of its sheath. The monster shrieked with rage. He really did not like that the pathetic man was able to resist his attacks, but after just a moment, the blade of the sword went vertically through the entire body of the monster, and he died instantly at the hands of the real protagonist of this story. As a result, only Damien was left standing in the arena, and in front of him was the body of the monster, which had been cut into 2 pieces. All the spectators were shocked at how strong this man was, and then the whole audience shouted enthusiastically in support of the hero of tonight. While the prince watched intently, even the protagonist did not expect Damien to be so strong and so easily defeat such a formidable monster. As he watched Damien leave the arena, he realized that this was the kind of man who should be the protagonist of the novel. This man would be the strongest swordsman, the one who could be considered a true genius. The protagonist asked his doctor to stay on guard and follow him, and he said that he would follow his orders. The protagonist and the doctor approached the guarded room and then approached the guard closely, which made the guard wary and asked what the guys wanted. But as soon as the guard received a huge bar of gold, he instantly allowed the hero along with the doctor to pass. The protagonist burst into Damien's room, apologizing for the sudden visit. Damien stared in incomprehension at the strange man who had just barged into his room. The protagonist was actually incredibly scared, but tried to keep his composure. The boy grabbed Damien's bottle filled with medicine, and the prince said he felt sorry for the boy because he was drinking such cheap painkillers, and suggested that he couldn't even get a good night's sleep with such medicine. Damien asked who the mystery man was, and while the prince said he was the man needed, Damien instantly assumed that the hero had come to sell him some medicine. As soon as the guy heard that this was roughly the case, he asked the protagonist to leave his room. The protagonist said there was no use for that medicine and threw Damien's vial away. This instantly pissed the guy off and he grabbed his blade. But as soon as he heard that the protagonist knew about the burning pain in the back of his head, he changed his mind. The prince felt that now the guy was definitely on his hook, whereupon he began a lecture on what exactly Damien was experiencing. He began to tell that the guy's pain usually starts in the back of his brain. Then the prince began to list the other symptoms of Damien's illness. Also, the prince started massaging the guy's shoulders, saying that they were tense. The prince assumed that Damien was curious as to how he knew all this. The protagonist said that the pain had a tendency to spread to the whole head, after which it felt as if his eyes were falling out of their orbits and sweat was pouring down his face. The prince also said that the pain is like waves, it builds up, then suddenly stops, and then it happens again. The prince said that such pain would drive Damien crazy. Damien listened to what the prince said about the impropriety of the guy's treatment. Because he wasn't getting rid of the disease, he was just trying to dull the pain with cheap drugs. Damien thought about the unknown man talking too much and thought about killing the hero. The protagonist called the guy a pathetic fool and said he should at least say something back. Eventually he asked who the protagonist was. The prince pointed his finger at himself and said that he was the crown prince of this country. This angered Damien and he grabbed his blade to end it all. Eventually the protagonist said he was joking and was called by Kuzman, who was Damien's patron and the one who mediated with the Colosseum. Damien was silent, as if he didn't know what to say, while the hero said that it was Kuzman who had told him what was tormenting him, and that the pills weren't working at all. Damien asked what the protagonist needed, and he confessed that he had a way to cure the young man. The boy assumed that the hero had just brought a new medicine, but he explained that no medicine would help. The prince asked the boy to take off his clothes and lie down, saying that he would explain everything in the order of treatment. The guy agreed to the strange request from the hero. After that, Rachel sat near Damien, who was lying on his stomach. The guy had some very strange seal on his back. The protagonist was surprised that the guy was not scared at all, and the guy said that he was a warrior. The prince was happy that the guy was so confident and took out a very strange object and put it on Damien's back. The protagonist was shining with happiness, holding the torch in his hand, because the guy would be the first in the world to experience this treatment. Damien again confidently declared that he was a true warrior, and it was nothing compared to what he had experienced. The protagonist lit a strange object, to the boy's words that his treatment was not frightening. Moments later, the doctor and the guard heard hell screaming from the room the protagonist entered. The prince began to mock Damien, because he was screaming like a little child, although he claimed to be a real warrior. In fact, the protagonist realized that the pain is not a joke, and mentally asked the guy to hold on a little longer. The reason why the guy can't leave the place was because of the mark, which is activated when the blood of the bearer starts to circulate. The battles in the Colosseum make the guy feel a terrible pain, and to reduce the pain a bit he bought some medicine borrowed from Kuzman, and to pay the debt he needs to participate in the fights further. The protagonist thought about what a scumbag Kuzman is, because he makes people work for free. The whole room was filled with thick smoke. The protagonist thought about the fact that now the mark is affected by a strong heat. The protagonist thought that if he can heal such a strong man, he will definitely stand on his side. The protagonist began to smile through his teeth, imagining what would happen if he helped all the gladiators of this place. At the time, the warrior seemed to be about to pass out from the pain he was experiencing, but still continued to restrain himself from screaming. Some time later, the treatment was over, and Damien rose from his lying position, shaking from the pain. The prince was pleased with himself and assumed that the guy was feeling much better. Suddenly the warrior felt relieved. He said that he felt renewed. He started to smile and seemed to shine with joy. It had not happened for a long time. The protagonist was proud of himself and thought it would be easier to communicate with Damien. The protagonist said that the guy was not completely cured and they would have to repeat the procedure. The protagonist said that he should not touch the wounds on his back and should not eat fatty foods, and the prince strictly said that the guy should not participate in any fights. The boy wants to object something, after which he clenched his fist and said that Kuzmin would not allow such things. The protagonist said that the guy will not have to fight and he will take care of it. This warm attitude shocked Damien. He didn't seem to expect something like this from him. He asked the prince to say his name, after which the protagonist again claimed to be the crown prince. After which there was silence between them. The guy suggested that the hero just didn't want to say his name. The prince asked Damien to follow his recommendations, because that's the only way he can be cured. He also said that the boy would not run away, no matter what happened in the Colosseum tonight. The guy didn't seem to understand what his benefactor was talking about. While the protagonist told the guy not to question the treatment, he turned his back and asked the guy to be here. The protagonist turned to the warrior and said that this was the only way they could meet again. This surprised Damien, after which he fell on one knee and said that he understood the prince's words. A while later Rachel and the doctor were moving along the corridor. The doctor didn't understand why the prince was looking for this guy and giving him such a strange treatment. They kept walking until the prince explained that the doctor would understand later and he should do what he said. The protagonist ordered the doctor to find the man and then described his appearance. While in the arena the spectators were betting and watching the fights, in another part of the place there was a bar where a huge number of people were drinking alcohol. The doctor was looking carefully for the man the prince had asked him to find, and suddenly he froze in place, then called out to the prince, for he was able to find the man they needed. The protagonist began to look in the direction the doctor had pointed, and so there was indeed a man sitting there who completely matched the description. Rachel began to sit down to this strange man, with the intention of finding out if he was the right man. The man looked angrily at Rachel while the prince asked if the man was a man named Kuzmin, after which the man said he didn't know the young man. The protagonist said he had a case, after which he said he wanted to ransom Damien, and asked how much money he needed to prepare for that. The man said with a smile on his face that the guy needed 9 trillion magan, and he added that only the crown prince himself could get that kind of money. Then he started laughing at the top of his voice while Rachel said that the man was lucky because he was the crown prince. The man looked with anger saying that the boy was a prince just like him. The protagonist was surprised that the prince was selling medicine in such a place, while the man got angry and told Rachel to get out as soon as possible. The guy started to walk away while the man looked at him carefully. He thought about the fact that he had never seen this guy before. Then he snapped his fingers and a moment later a man came up to him and told him that the guy who had just passed by was trying to scam him. He asked for information about the protagonist, then said that the man might resort to torture and interrogation, and then with a mad look he said that the guy should kill Rahel and throw his body into the river. An hour later the gates opened, after which Kuzmin did not understand what was happening. While someone's bloody feet were approaching him, Kuzmin was surprised that his subordinate was in such a bad state. He asked what was wrong with him and why he was silent, while the gates opened again, and the protagonist appeared with the knights. The prince began to take off his wig, then also began to take out something. The knights at the same time announced that the secret Imperial inspector had arrived. Then the protagonist, who stopped hiding that he was a prince, showed his badge, which was covered with gold. Exactly an hour before the prince broke into the building, it was evening outside. The protagonist ordered the doctor to behave more naturally, because at this rate they can be exposed. Dochair said he would do his best, and confessed that he had never been followed before. While the prince thought he knew exactly how things would turn out while he was being watched, the protagonist knew that as soon as Kuzmin felt the slightest threat, he would send his men to keep an eye on the target. It turned out that this was the reason why the prince approached Kuzmin at that very moment. While the guy started to draw his weapon, the protagonist thought that it was too predictable. Suddenly the man who was following the protagonist was stopped by an unknown man. The man was covered in armor and looked incredibly menacing. A moment later, the man was surrounded by a huge number of knights, who instantly said that the guy was accused of attempting to assassinate the prince. At that time in the present, the protagonist who revealed his status showed the seal, after which the enemy saw a huge number of knights in front of him. While the doctor did not understand how this could happen, namely that Rachel became a secret inspector, the protagonist asked the doctor to ignore it, after which the guy thanked the knight and said that they all did a very good job. While Kuzmin looked with hatred towards the prince, not understanding how such a thing could happen. He didn't understand why the Imperial guards were in this place, while the prince who introduced himself as the heir ordered all the knights to raze this place to the ground. The protagonist also ordered the capture of Kuzmin, who instantly became alert, after which a large number of knights proceeded to carry out their orders. The doctor was amazed at what he saw before him, for everything went strictly according to the plan of the protagonist. Under the work of the knights, the doctor thought that the prince had definitely become a different person. He was literally able to subdue an entire underground organization. The prince was overjoyed to see the knights apprehending all the people. The protagonist praised everyone for doing their job so well, while thinking that he could get a huge amount of extra life. The protagonist mockingly referred to Kuzmin as a crown prince selling drugs. The man was very scared. He knew that once he was caught he would be finished. The man instantly started running away from the place where the knights were gathered. He didn't understand how such a brat could be a real crown prince. And he didn't understand why he needed Damien. The man continued to run away thinking that he would have to hide for a while. Then he opened the doors, and to his surprise he was met with a huge number of blades. Kuzmin didn't understand how the knights ended up in this place, while the protagonist gloated saying that he knew Kuzmin was headed to this very place. It turned out that he and the doctor were betting and the prince won a small amount of money. Kuzmin didn't understand what was going on and how he should act in this situation, while Rachel suggested that the man didn't expect such a thing and couldn't imagine how it all turned out. The protagonist stated that people do have to pay for medicine, and he also stated that he hates it when people don't pay for medicine. The man didn't understand what the prince was talking about, which is why the protagonist wanted to know the price Damien owed. Kuzmin stood there and said nothing. His fists clenched and began to shake with anger when he heard the protagonist's words that the man was at fault for refusing to make a fair deal. Kuzmin headed with his weapon towards the protagonist with hatred in his eyes and a bright desire to kill him. Suddenly the man's face was instantly hit with an incredibly fast fist, causing him to drop his weapon to the ground and fall instantly from the concussion. The man tried to cover his nose, which was bleeding. The knight said that the man had better not get up from now on, while the enemy himself seemed to be up to something not good. It turns out that in his mouth was a strange capsule. After that he instantly bite this capsule. He thought that exactly in 5 seconds this capsule will explode. After that should start poisonous gas, which easily paralyzes people. He thought that the knights may die while he spit out the capsule in time and can survive in this situation. He also anticipated the moment when he could personally cut off the crown prince's head. Kuzmin thought that this was the perfect plan for him to win this battle. In his mind he started counting down the time until the capsule would explode. Suddenly a hand covered the man's mouth, which instantly caused surprise on his face, while the prince with a frantic face assumed that Kuzmin was very insistently trying to spit something out. The protagonist smiled while there was an explosion in the man's mouth, after which the man fell to the ground as the paralysis began to progress rapidly, and at this rate he would lose consciousness in a few minutes. The man began to pull the antidote from his clothes, as suddenly the hand of the protagonist instantly followed in the same place, and the hands of the prince was a vial of antidote to the poison, which took in Kuzmin. The protagonist assumed that the man was dying of curiosity, for he appeared to know a great deal. The protagonist opened the vial of antidote and said that he would not say where he got the information from. The man's face was clearly horrified. He seemed to realize that at this rate he would just die, while the protagonist with a smile on his face began to absorb the contents of the bottle, depriving the man of the last chance to get rid of the poison. The prince complained about the disgusting taste of the medicine, while the man seemed to have lost the ability to speak, but the desperation and desire not to die was clearly visible in the man's eyes. While the protagonist threw the empty vial behind his back, saying that it was the man's own fault for poisoning himself. The protagonist was about to use an ability that could increase his lifespan, when the man started to feel sick to his stomach, and it looked like he was going to die any minute. The man collapsed on the cold floor and seemed to lose consciousness. The protagonist felt great. Then the prince started to press a point on his back and the man started to vomit with great force. Then the prince with a smile on his face was about to inject the antidote into the man's body. As a result he started to channel the mana liquid through his fingers, while Kuzmin was in great pain which caused him to lose consciousness. Through this procedure the protagonist increased the life expectancy of this man by 21 years. The protagonist's life expectancy increased by 4 days which made the prince rejoice. The protagonist ordered the knights to arrest this man, and now the protagonist was going to take what he came to this place for. While elsewhere, the knights had been defeated by Damien and the other gladiators, and were standing in the hallway before the second round began. The knight was afraid to approach as a guy. as the gladiators appeared to be incredibly strong, and they couldn't beat them. The protagonist said he warned the lad to stay home, and he stood near his knights surprised that the crown prince had come to them. Daman looked at the protagonist carefully, who approached him and asked if the boy now believed he was the crown prince. Daman slowly lowered his hand that held the weapon. He remembered the past when he stood over the corpse of his mother. He thought about how he wished he could repeat that day, the day he was left all alone in this cruel world. He thought about how that day could be described as the day he was abandoned. Sometime later Daman heard the voice of the hero who ordered him to get up. Then the guy instantly jumped out of bed. The doctor introduced himself to the guy. He said that he was the chief doctor of the prince's crowns. Daman also introduced himself to the man. The protagonist said to stop with the introductions and added that they should follow him as they have a lot of things to do. The doctor didn't understand what the prince was up to this time, while the protagonist asked the man to just trust him. Daman was watching all this closely, while in another room called the clinic, the protagonist stood in front of a huge number of gladiators who were sitting on their beds. Daman asked what this place was, while the hero replied that it was a treatment room. One of the men marveled that the prince had not only rescued them from that hellish place, but also allowed them to live in the palace and treat them as well. The man naturally asked why the prince was so kind to them, while the prince realized that it was no surprise that they didn't trust him. The protagonist thought that if he could rid the gladiators of the curse of the mark, he would increase his life expectancy very much. The protagonist said that nothing in this world is free and that he is not some kindly man. The prince said that he was very sick, when suddenly one of the gladiators shouted that everyone in the empire knows about it. The protagonist remembered this guy thinking that he would treat him with special ruthlessness. The protagonist stated that no one could help him, and that is why he began to learn the treatment himself. The protagonist assumed that Daman understood what the protagonist was getting at. Daman assumed that they would be the guinea pigs in the prince's new treatment. The protagonist said that was exactly the case, which surprised all the gladiators a bit. Daman told the others that the pain was practically gone after just one treatment. The gladiators thought that Daman could be trusted, while the prince asked if anyone was concerned about the upcoming treatment. The prince was pleased because in the end everyone was fine with the treatment he was going to give. Some time later, the men began to scream horribly from that place, and 6 days after the beginning of the treatment, they looked exhausted from the pain. The protagonist saw the guys throwing up and breaking out in a cold sweat. The prince realized it was withdrawal after they stopped using the painkillers. While Daman looked completely fine, and from the outside it looked like he was surviving the treatment better than anyone else. The prince immediately began to approach the boy and asked him if he was dizzy and nauseous, and he said he was. The prince was amazed at how Daman professionally kept his symptoms in check, the protagonist thinking that now he needed to think about how to change his treatment methods. A while later, the prince announced to all the people that they needed to get as much rest and drink as much water as possible. He ordered Sergio to stay in bed, and it seemed to be because of his terrible condition. The protagonist realized he felt so bad because of the withdrawal symptoms, even though the gladiator denied everything the prince said he would help him. The protagonist pulled out a needle, which caused the man to misunderstand. The protagonist actually doubted that acupuncture would work in this situation. The protagonist realized that because the man had been taking medication for the longest time it would be difficult, so he started with a point on his leg. Then the man's body started to move, and suddenly his hand went towards the prince. Then the man pounced on the protagonist and grabbed his neck. The protagonist didn't understand what was happening while the gladiator continued to strangle him. The man continued to violently strangle the protagonist, who could not say a word because the man had not a joke force, as suddenly the gladiator began to lose consciousness, after which the prince finally freed himself from the man. It turned out that the hero was helped by Daman, who asked if the prince was okay, and the protagonist said that he was fine and grabbed the guy's hand. The protagonist was well aware that this was due to withdrawal, specifically cramps all over his body due to minimal stimulation. The protagonist assumed that even a small amount of stimulation felt to the man like a sword thrust. The protagonist was well aware that he needed thinner needles to deal with this problem. The protagonist carefully read the letter he received from the blacksmith. It turned out that he was able to create a needle as thick as a thread, but he wasn't sure if he could create several of them in the same way. He also wrote that he wasn't capable of it because he wasn't a dwarven craftsman, which made the protagonist angry. The prince had no idea what to do or how to deal with the physical condition of the patients. The system notified the protagonist that the organs were feeling negative due to the stress the hero was under. The heart seemed to want to give some sort of clue, while the lungs also said that they really needed help. The system notified the protagonist that he had received a guide on how he could use the points. It turned out the guy could summon monsters. The cost of summoning the first monster was 300 points, and the total on the hero's balance was 500. The protagonist said that he needed a creature that would be able to create many thin needles. Then the system accepted the protagonist's request and several boxes appeared in front of him. The first candidate was a happy grunting creature, the second was a steel creator, and the third was a hedgehog. It turned out that only one of the options could fulfill the request by 100%, the other could fulfill the request by 50%, and the third could not fulfill the request at all. The protagonist began to reason carefully, as the names of the creatures were really strange. The prince continued to stand in place thinking about who to choose. He stood silently for several hours, so it was already a clear day outside and the guy continued to stand in place without making a choice. The heart was angry and screamed that the main character finally chose hedgehog. Then the prince did exactly what the heart told him to do. Then the main character started praying that everything would work out as it should. Then the incredibly cute hedgehog jumped into the hands of the main character. He seemed incredibly happy that he was chosen as the first pet. It turned out that the size of the hedgehog could be changed by feeding it seeds. Red seeds made the pet huge for 12 hours. Blue seeds made it tiny. The ability of the hedgehog were endless prickles, as well as the dispersal of prickly chestnut, as well as he could shoot a needle and the pain depended on the color of the needle. The protagonist instantly asked if the pet would mind if he borrowed a needle from him, whereupon he asked the hedgehog to give him a white, brown, and black needle. The lad instantly tried using the white needle and there was practically no pain in using it. The brown one caused quite a lot of pain, while the black needle looked very ominous, and the hero did not risk trying it on himself. The protagonist glowed with joy and said that the hedgehog was just a great pet that suited him perfectly. A while later, the doctor didn't understand what the prince was doing now and what was that creature on his shoulder. The protagonist introduced his new pet, and when asked why he needed a hedgehog, he started making up some nonsense. The prince then began to walk away saying that the doctor could get the details from the pet itself, while the doctor assumed that the creature was a ghostly monster. The doctor remembered that their ancestor Lloyd had such monsters. They were incredibly rare in their world, but if they chose an owner they would serve him to the end. He looked towards the prince and had no idea how he had gotten his hands on this pet. Sometime later, the man began to beg the protagonist for forgiveness, and said that he should pay for his transgression with his life. The protagonist said that the man didn't need to worry because his reaction was normal, and then asked if the man felt any pain, but he didn't understand what the prince was talking about. It turned out that the prince had already stuck a few needles in the man's arm and he didn't even notice it. The prince was very pleased with the effectiveness of the white needles, after which the protagonist proceeded to give acupuncture to all the gladiators. The protagonist was able to gain a full 80 days of life after completing the treatment, and his ability level increased to 1 to 1950. The protagonist was shining with happiness as he now had more time to live. As Damien squeezed his hand, he didn't understand what they had done that would make the crown prince so happy that he had cured them. The protagonist decided to finish with the gladiators, but looking at all these happy people, an idea arose in his mind that made a smile begin to appear on his face. At that time in the palace, the emperor was holding a mug of tea. The man wanted to give the emperor a report on the king prince. It turned out that the gladiators got a job as bodyguards of the prince's crowns, which aroused the king's interest. It turned out that they all called themselves special Imperial guards, and the protagonist made a contract to pay them money. The king thought deeply about what his son had been able to do, because in the past he had only been lying in bed due to illness. The emperor began to smile as his son was becoming more and more interesting. The emperor was also informed that the protagonist had gathered all the servants in the palace and then began to mercilessly pierce their bodies with needles. This caused a particular misunderstanding with the emperor. After a while, the hero stuck a needle into one of the men, then asked if the man was in pain after he stuck the needle in, and he instantly said that he was not in pain at all. The prince asked why the man was making noises of pain if it was only a needle. Eventually, the prince ordered the next man to come up. A few days ago, the prince was standing outside and the sun was shining very brightly. The protagonist asked how Damien was feeling after the treatment, and he confessed that he was in a little pain. The prince surprised Damien by saying that he was sorry that the treatment was over so quickly. The protagonist confessed that Damien was able to heal completely. He also added that the treatment had worked and he was done with the experiments, to which Damien remained silent. The boy thanked the protagonist for his help, but the prince asked him to stop. The protagonist asked the boy to listen to what he had to say. He confessed that he saw an incredible talent in Damien and he really didn't want to part like that. That's why Rachel offered him to be his personal bodyguard. The prince said that he would make sure that the guy was paid well, that he could even save for his retirement. The protagonist thought about the fact that Damien will soon advance to the level of Swordmaster and will also get the syndrome, and most likely the guy realizes it as well. Swordmaster syndrome is when all of your senses are heightened but difficult to control, which makes it incredibly painful. The protagonist said they'd sign a fair contract where the guy would also get time off and vacation. The prince realized that the recruitment process was going badly and offered the guy the opportunity to finish the job at any time, while someone was watching closely how the prince was trying to persuade Damien to become a bodyguard. The protagonist offered only 4 working days a week, saying that it was hard to refuse, after which other gladiators jumped out of the bushes and asked to be hired as well. All the guys wanted to get such a job, saying that this way they can pay for the treatment. The protagonist realized that the guys just wanted to get the money and benefits he had promised them. The protagonist assumed that this was better than lying about loyalty. The prince also realized that he should have his own army, since the Imperial guards were not his alone. The protagonist said that all the guys were hired and they would be his personal Imperial guards. Everyone was mad with joy, while Damien continued to stand silently. Suddenly a smile appeared on the guy's face, which was very unusual. The protagonist thought about the fact that he had gotten very little time to live, even though he had increased the total part of the guy's lives by 100 years. The protagonist realized that with his weak body, he couldn't go looking for patients on his own. Suddenly he looked at his palace and a crazy thought arose in his mind. The prince was determined to open a clinic in the small palace, while others did not know what a clinic was, which surprised the prince. As the doctor began to shake, then he shouted to the prince. The doctor knew very well that the prince had an incredibly kind heart and wanted to open a clinic to help the sick. The prince said that he did, and was glad that the doctor finally understood his intentions. The doctor couldn't believe that the prince cared about the health of the townspeople despite his illness. They looked like a shining duo that shouted that they were doing everything for the people of this town. While Damien watched this strange scene in silence, the protagonist decided that the first thing he needed to do was to treat the employees in their palace. He thought that people would not feel comfortable going to the clinic in the palace. The doctor said that people would not feel comfortable going to the clinic in the prince's palace. He wanted to make an advertisement with the help of successful treatment. Once people start talking about that this place really treats people well, they will even go to this palace to get cured. The main character was angry because all the people in the palace were incredibly healthy. The main character got only 2 days for examining 500 people, which made him angry and wonder what to do next, but suddenly a good idea came to his mind. The doctor pulled out a huge stack of papers that had information about the main character's 500 patients. The doctor said that they had collected information about the families, genders, ages, and illnesses of the clients. The protagonist was going to check their family's health since they were all so healthy. The guy assumed that there would be at least one person with a serious illness, so he started looking through a huge amount of information, but even after a huge amount of time he still couldn't find even one suitable patient. The prince didn't understand why this was happening. Everyone was simply healthy, and there were only 10 pages left. Suddenly Damien said that he was disappointed with the prince, which caused him to misunderstand. He assumed that for the guy patients are just weapons. The protagonist didn't understand what the guy was talking about, and the guy confessed that it felt like he was looking for people on the verge of death, which was the real truth that hit the protagonist right in the chest. The doctor said that the guy had no right to be so impertinent and also assumed that the prince definitely had a plan. The protagonist thanked the doctor for defending him, but also added that the guy wasn't entirely wrong, which made the doctor apologize to the prince. The guy started talking about how the prince was too strict. After all, the doctor had stood up for him, and then the doctor started complaining that Damien was too rough on the prince. The protagonist threw them out of his office, because in the end they were just annoying him. The protagonist began to examine the last pages. Suddenly the protagonist began to read about the brother of a servant, who was often shivering, also from the mouth of the guy was foaming, as if he was possessed by a demon. Also the doctors could not do anything, as well as the priests. The prince was incredibly glad, for this was exactly the patient he needed. The girl brought her little brother with her, and began to introduce the little brother, while the boy himself seemed shy and uncomfortable. The prince said hello to the boy, who immediately said hello in return. The hero allowed the boy to call him simply Rachel, thinking that the child was very much worried, because it was the first time in the palace. The protagonist seemed to know a great way to cheer up the young patient. Then he took out a handkerchief from his pocket, which he held out in front of the boy. Suddenly a candy appeared in place of the handkerchief, which instantly caused amazement and delight in the eyes of the little guy. The prince in turn held out the candy and said that it was his gift. Suddenly the boy began to worry very much, and his face completely changed. The prince asked what happened, and the boy confessed that the prince is not allowed to touch him. The boy sincerely believed that he was cursed by a spirit, and did not want anyone to get infected. The boy confessed that the other children mocked him and called him a weirdo, to which the prince immediately objected. The boy started talking about how they started fighting with the children, after which his eyes went black. The boy started talking about how he sometimes has a strange feeling in his body and it starts to shake. Then the boy feels like he is falling and he starts to hear a very strange voice. The boy said that as soon as he wakes up from the attack he has no strength at all. The prince said that it became a little clear to him, after which the protagonist hugged the boy with the words that the boy was a really brave man, and he was worthy to hold on. The boy began to cry from such support and asked the prince not to touch him, because he thought that it could hurt the protagonist. The protagonist began to check the boy's body, saying that there were no evil spirits. It turned out that the boy was generally healthy, but he has epilepsy, which surprised the protagonist. The protagonist thought that there wouldn't be a problem if the body didn't react so strongly to epilepsy. The protagonist said that the boy is not strange at all, after which he stated with an enthusiastic look that the crown prince is never wrong. The protagonist cannot find the cause of the epilepsy. Suddenly the boy turned to the protagonist that threw him out of his thoughts. It turned out the boy had an epileptic attack and seemed to be quite ill. The prince didn't understand why the seizure had started right away. While others were genuinely worried about the kid, Damien grabbed his blade. The doctor was screaming that the boy was indeed possessed by an evil spirit, and Damien was screaming for the prince to get away from the kid. The protagonist started to get angry at his subordinates because it was really a harmless boy who needed help. The prince instantly asked the guys to stop this circus and then said that the illness was not related to an evil spirit and the boy was just sick and needed to be protected. The boys saw the main character ordering them to bring a pillow, after which the boy continued to shake even though he was on the pillow. The doctor said that the boy had foam from his mouth and suggested that he should wipe it off with his finger. The main character said that they should not do that, because now the boy's muscles were moving randomly and he could bite and even swallow the towel. Everyone listened to the prince's words that they should just wait until the boy's seizure was over, while the protagonist noticed a very strange thing. It turned out that the boy's body was somehow emanating mana and he could feel it perfectly. The protagonist thought that with his powers he would be able to find the true cause of this disease. Then the prince touched the boy's body with his hand and began to infuse his mana. Then in front of the protagonist's face there were a lot of strange mana flows that were not controlled at all. The protagonist continued his search while making assumptions. Rahel's heart was very heavy as he was using a lot of mana, but this didn't stop him and he continued his journey as he came across the boy's brain, which was glowing very brightly. The prince was now completely sure that the matter was in the vagus nerve. The main character was surprised because it was in it there was a false signal that caused a seizure in the brain and in the whole body. The protagonist ordered a blanket to be brought, as the boy needed to rest. The protagonist with his last strength told the boys not to make noise and not to make a commotion. After that the protagonist lost consciousness and fell to the ground. The guy kept falling deeper and deeper into his sleep, happy that he found the reason and will be able to help the boy. A while later it was night outside. While Rahel opened his eyes, the protagonist didn't feel quite right, but assumed his mana core had improved. Damien startled the prince by being around, and he said that the boy had slept for half a whole day. The hero asked how the boy was doing now, and it turned out he had recently woken up too, but he was completely exhausted. The protagonist said that it is normal that the boy has no strength because he had a very strong attack. The protagonist thought that mana was much better than all modern medical technology, because he was so easily able to find out the cause of the disease. The protagonist began to move thinking that he needed to use nerve stimulation to treat the boy. Damien didn't understand where the prince wanted to go in the middle of the night, while the protagonist put on his jacket, then announced that he was going to head out to be struck by lightning. Meanwhile, the guards were guarding some building. As soon as they noticed the people, they got ready to fight and asked who they were. Suddenly, the guard's face changed completely when he saw the identities of the people. The protagonist asked them to escort him to Mr. Xanath's chambers, and they all headed to their destination. They arrived, and an incredibly beautiful door appeared in front of the protagonist, after which he burst into the mage's chambers without shame or conscience, which took him by surprise. The mage's butler was shocked that it turned out to be a prince, and did not understand why he came. The protagonist immediately apologized for such a sudden visit, and also said that he had a request. The prince asked the palace mage to hit him with lightning magic right in the back, and with an incredibly harmless face. It seemed the mage didn't quite understand what was going on right now. The king had summoned the mage the day before and told him that Rachel had changed a lot and was doing whatever he wanted. The emperor had also told him that the prince might be doing something stupid and that he was worried about it. While the magician thought that all people act stupid when it comes to their children, the protagonist was very insistent on asking the mage to hit him with magic, while the old man himself thought that the guy had really changed a lot. The mage thought that the prince was completely mad and looked at him with contempt. Between them there was a short dialogue, and the hero explained that a lightning strike should not be fatal. The protagonist said that the mage would need to inject the lightning for 3 hours without a break. The mage thought about the fact that lightning magic was incredibly destructive. A strong mage could destroy cities, while the prince was asking for such a thing. The magician asked if the prince understood that such a request would be very difficult to fulfill. The protagonist understood it perfectly well by drawing a parallel with driving a car for 3 hours at 30 kilometers per hour. The protagonist said that this was the reason why he had come to him, as he didn't know anyone who could control mana better. The mage rejoiced under the words of the prince that he is the best mage in the empire. All the organs also supported this mage, while other people silently watched the strange picture. The magician thought about the fact that he was actually not so much against participating in this test. The protagonist promised that if he died, the mage would not be held responsible, and said that the knights and Damien would witness his words. The prince said it was to help another person, and the mage finally agreed to the venture. The protagonist said they would start right away. The protagonist thought about not being able to use electricity on a child and was going to try it on himself first. Then the mage asked if the prince was ready, and the protagonist started to gather mana around his body. Then a charge of electricity started to appear in the mage's hand, and he directed an incredibly small beam of electricity towards the prince, wondering if he had applied enough power. The protagonist smiled, because he knew that the palace mage would be able to do it, and thought that now it was his turn. The protagonist began to absorb the electricity, thinking that he could use it to subdue the boy's wandering nerve. The protagonist was overjoyed. He thought that Azrahan's core technique was really incredible. The protagonist tried to stop the mage, who said he could go on all day. Then a shout was heard from the prince, who ordered the mage to stop. While the prince had gathered a huge number of people who started gossiping about the guy before entering, the doors of the room opened and they went inside, where the prince, his doctor, Damien, the Imperial mage, and a little boy were already there. The protagonist told the boy that he would be in pain during the treatment. The boy grabbed the needle tightly, and without answering the boy's questions, he quickly stuck the needle into his neck. The protagonist approached the magician to say something, and then the magician began to direct electricity directly at the protagonist, who began to gradually gather electricity that entered the body. The protagonist thought that everyone would see this revolutionary treatment, while the doctor was fainting because his prince was being maimed. The protagonist started to treat the current, then he was back inside the boy's body. He found what he needed, then instantly realized that he had seen something sinister. It turned out the mana flow was moving quite erratically, which made the prince start to run because the boy was about to have a seizure. The boy asked how long he had to endure this pain, while the prince was hurrying with all his might, because the attack was only minutes away. The protagonist was in the right place, thinking that now it was time for him to start. The protagonist thought that he could not postpone this treatment, because if the servants see that nothing works they will immediately tell everyone about it. The protagonist turned to the magician, then said that the magician would increase the power of magic in 3 times. This caused misunderstanding in the magician, while the prince said that later everything will be explained. When the mage said that the prince would be hurt, he said that it didn't matter at all. The mage instantly started releasing a huge amount of electricity, causing the prince to instantly feel more pain. The attack was seconds away, and the protagonist was looking for the carotid artery spot. The boy was moving at top speed trying to get there before the attack. The protagonist started to wrap the artery with a scroll of electricity. While the boy started to feel absolutely terrible, everyone watched with horror what would happen in the end. There were only 2 seconds left before the attack would start with full force, while the right place was already wrapped, and the protagonist was sweating and realized that he had only 1 second left. There was only 1 second left before the start of the attack. But at the same time the prince finished his preparations. Discharges of lightning began to pass along the paths that the guy laid out, while in the present the boy felt just disgusting. It seemed the attack began, as suddenly after 1 moment the boy was much easier, and it seemed all the symptoms went away. The protagonist wondered if the boy was feeling better after the treatment. While the mage was finally able to breathe, because he had also tried hard during the treatment, the girl was shocked that nothing had happened, because the boy always lost consciousness after the pain started. The protagonist breathed a sigh of relief, for he was able to do everything on the edge, and his body was still numb. The protagonist was able to get a whole 3 days of extra lives, and the total life counter became 161 days. The system pleased the prince that he was able to increase his core level to the 2nd, and now he had a mana boost of 130%. Suddenly the organ that had been sleeping all this time, namely the liver, burst into the room. He instantly started yelling at the other organs, calling them lazy assholes, then threw the bag with his belongings and shouted for them to pick them up. There was an awkward silence between the organs, after which Hart was surprised that a newcomer had joined them. Suddenly one of the organs started screaming and cheering, because he was finally no longer the newcomer. He found himself in front of the liver, which was watching him very closely. A moment later the organ got a punch in the face from the liver. It turned out he didn't want to be a newbie at all, and seemed to look confident enough not to become one. The protagonist was able to get a lot of points and his balance became 1300. The prince turned to the system hoping to see some more rewards, but that was it. Suddenly the prince was pulled out of his thoughts by the cries of the boy who was addressing him. The boy began to say that there was something wrong with him, to which the prince replied that everything was as it should be. The protagonist said that the boy would be as healthy as he was for the rest of his life, which made the child very happy, and he looked at the prince with admiration. The prince in front of all the people declared that the boy would never experience that pain again. The girl began to cry that her brother was cured, and then the boy enthusiastically greeted his favorite sister. They hugged each other very tightly, and pure smiles shone on their faces. The protagonist rejoiced that he had succeeded in curing such an uncomplicated ailment. All the servants of the palace were weeping with happiness and sweetness at the thought of the hero that now in this hospital will be very many visitors. The prince was beyond joy because the more there will be sick, the more he will get life, and the more he will be able to live in this beautiful world. Suddenly the main character's head began to spin, and then the last thing he saw was the doctor and Damien, who ran to his side. It turned out that the prince had lost consciousness because of the stress his body was undergoing. A while later the room was dark and the prince was sleeping very soundly in his bed. Then his eyes started to open and the first thing he thought about was how long he had been unconscious. The doctor was glad that the prince was finally awake, and the protagonist was surprised that the guys were watching him sleep together, assuming they had no business doing such nonsense. The doctor grimaced and said that he was really tired of watching the protagonist sleep, then burst into tears, shouting that he kept praying fervently for the protagonist's health as he watched the prince sleep. Damien explained the situation by saying that the prince slept for 2 days, which shocked the protagonist, because he did not expect to spend so much time in bed. Suddenly the magician turned to the guy and began to slowly approach, then with a very blank expression filled with despair. He said that how he would explain to the emperor that the prince spent 2 whole days in bed because of his magic. The protagonist immediately inquired about the boy's well-being, and the boy jumped out from under the man's back and declared that he was perfectly fine. The boy was very much overjoyed, while the prince didn't understand what the boy was doing in this place. The doctor listened as the boy told him that he had been pestering him until he was allowed to enter. Then the boy confessed that he had done it all just to give one thing away, then held out a pendant with a wooden heart. The protagonist was amazed that the boy could do something like that in such a short time. The prince thought that it was unnecessary, because in fact he had saved the boy only for the reason of increasing his own life. Suddenly Rahel was pulled from his thoughts by the words of the boy, who confessed that from now on he dreamed of becoming a great man who would help others like the protagonist. Such words seemed to touch the prince to the depths of his soul, after which he grasped the pendant and said that it was made just fine. The prince sincerely thanked the little patient, after which the protagonist said that the best reward for him was that the boy was completely healthy. Such words brought a smile to the doctor's face, while Rachel said that he needed some more rest, after which all the boys began to leave the room so that Rachel could regain his strength. The boy started waving his hand as a sign of farewell, and hoped that they would see each other as soon as possible. The prince also waved and said that they would. After that, the doors to the room of the protagonist slammed shut, and the guy began to scrutinize the thing that the patient gave him. He thought about the fact that no one would wear such a thing, because without the stones the pendant looked quite simple. Looking at the incredibly beautiful moon, the prince said that it was time to sleep, and then he lay down on the bed with the pendant and fell asleep. A while later, a boy's voice was heard, informing Mom that he had arrived home. The mom was shocked that her son had arrived home that day, while the guy confessed that he had taken a vacation, which turned out to be some kind of special time off. A while later, the family gathered around the table and the boy revealed that the crown prince himself had given him and many other servants the day off. The father of the family asked how the prince's health was, and the boy confessed that the prince looked much better. The boy also stated that the prince had started doing some incredibly strange things. He told his parents that the prince started to treat people like a real doctor, and then he started to take out a strange leaflet from his pocket and opened it right on the kitchen table, after which the whole family stared at the contents of the leaflet with astonishment. Suddenly, a huge number of similar leaflets began to float above the heads of the inhabitants. Sometime later, the inhabitants began to gather around the board on which these posters were attached, on which it was written that in the hospital they are able to cure the spine. While the protagonist stood at the window and anticipated the huge number of people who would come to him, because he had placed a huge amount of advertising. The doctor announced that it was time for him and the prince to depart. The prince smiled, for something good was about to happen. While they were walking down the corridor, the doctor asked why the prince had decided to wake up so early, and he confessed that today was the opening day of their clinic. The doctor said that he had prepared absolutely all the ingredients that the protagonist had requested. Suddenly the doctor stopped and turned to the prince. He asked how the protagonist was able to learn these amazing things, namely the preparation of strange potions and other things. The doctor confessed that he was incredibly curious about how needles can heal joints. He was a doctor himself. It turned out that the doctor was very interested in the prince's medical techniques, but he could not understand how they worked. The doctor, with a sad expression on his face, confessed that he was a little upset about all this, while the prince silently looked in his direction, thinking that he perfectly understands the doctor's worries because he is a doctor too. After that, the guy was a little silent, and with a confident expression said that he came from another world. The protagonist said that in the other world he earned money by treating other people. Suddenly the doctor's face became disappointed, and he confessed that he was trying to have a serious dialogue. The prince said he was telling the truth, while the doctor continued to disbelieve him. In the end, he did not believe the prince, and then with a confident look said that he dreamed of becoming the best doctor and sharing the prince's joy. The protagonist asked what the doctor was doing before, and he didn't understand the question. So the prince said that they didn't have time for that and it was time for them to get to work. The protagonist thought that he had only gotten this far because of the doctor's diligence in helping him. The protagonist hoped with all his heart that people would not be afraid to come to his clinic. The prince seemed to be very worried about what was about to happen because in the past his clinic had just gone bankrupt and ruined his life. The prince walked down the corridor and prayed in his mind that there would be a large number of patients waiting for him. Then he instantly opened the windows and greeted the people in his clinic in a loud voice. While the place where people were supposed to be was completely empty, literally not a single person had come. The prince was completely shattered. It seemed like life had left his body and he was going through the worst phase of his life again. Without any expression of life on his face, the guy started to descend the stairs. As suddenly the doctor turned to the prince, after noticing something. The prince did not understand what the doctor wanted from him, who asked the guy to look down. Suddenly the prince's face completely changed. It turned out that in front of him stood a huge number of people who were eager to get treatment. There was just a huge line in front of the doors. This is what opening day was supposed to be like. The protagonist checked the old man's pulse, while the guy asked what he should do. The protagonist ordered the guy to walk around and look for patients who needed help. The protagonist was checking on the old man while thinking that the patient care system was not that good and needed to be improved. Suddenly the system told the hero that his pulse-checking skill had improved and he could now consult with the patient's organs. The protagonist's organs dressed up and then they headed off to meet the other organs, while the liver remained completely unshaken. While the other organs were quite old and were waiting for their congeners. The protagonist was amazed at the analysis he saw before his eyes. All the organs were fine, but the liver was suffering from hepatitis and the old man should definitely quit drinking. The prince said that the old man's liver was very badly damaged. The protagonist began to name all the symptoms of the old man and said that from today he should completely stop drinking alcohol. It turned out that the old man simply could not eat without alcohol, after which he ordered as a prince and not a doctor and said that in case of refusal, he would throw the old man in the dungeon. A while later evening came and the hero announced that everyone was finished and the other patients were rescheduled for another day. One of the robots thanked the prince for the hard work he had shown them, and the girl apologized for preparing the medicine incorrectly. The protagonist said that the boys did a great job and said that they would have to work hard tomorrow. The protagonist thought that it would be nice if there were nurses from his world in this world. Suddenly someone was running down the corridor very fast, and then the doctor started shouting that a patient had arrived, and the man behind the doctor was the eldest son of the Dinrai family. He begged the prince to save his dying mother, who looked quite ill. A while later, the prince inquired exactly how long the woman had been in this condition. Dinrai began to tell him that his mother had been fine since noon, but after the sun went down, she started getting worse. The protagonist instantly began to use his ability, and he instantly realized that the disease the woman had contracted when she had wiped out an entire 400,000-man army was Napoleon himself, causing the prince's face to show signs of horror. The disease was called typhus epidemic. It was deadly and transmitted by Rickettsia bacteria. The protagonist stood silently in place, and after a short pause he inquired when the woman had last taken a bath. The protagonist learned from the man that the woman took a bath literally every day. Such astonished the prince, because it was very strange that a man who took a bath every day fell ill with this disease. The prince inquired about the house and the woman's bed, and the man said that everything was in order, and everything was clean. Suddenly the man remembered a detail. He said that recently there had been an incident in which the woman's carriage had broken down and the farmers had allowed her to sleep in their bed. The woman had spent the whole night in that place. The prince realized that since the fever had started on that day, the incubation period of the disease was 15 days. The protagonist understood that the symptoms were a perfect match for typhus. The protagonist revealed that it was in that place that the woman contracted the disease. The prince explained that the disease was transmitted through lice bites. The prince realized that the situation was terrible, because the woman was old and the fever was quite high. The protagonist clenched his teeth as at this rate the woman would become anemic and some parts of her skin would necrose. The protagonist turned to all his servants and told them to wipe the woman thoroughly with wet towels. One of the servants asked what they should do with the woman's clothes, while the protagonist ordered the bed, clothes, and even the servants' clothes to be burned. The prince said that if the girls failed at least one condition they would be instantly fired. The protagonist told the man to send someone to report to the family about the woman's condition. The prince ordered everyone to get started on the tasks he had given out, and people started running in a hurry to get everything done as soon as possible. On the table was an iron knife. The prince realized that the cure for the girl's illness was a tonic soup that would definitely help. This soup would reduce the symptoms of fever, and it was made of conifer and kutsu root. The prince gave the medicine to the woman with the words that she should drink it and then she would feel better. After a while the maid wet the woman's forehead with a towel. Later evening came and the treatment continued with the soup. They continued to help the woman for the next 24 hours, But even after a while the woman began to look worse than before the treatment began. The prince thought about the fact that they had been taking care of the patient for 3 days around the clock, and the condition had gotten worse. The protagonist realized that in this case one soup would definitely not be enough. The protagonist thought about the fact that the balance of the patient's yin and yang had been completely disturbed and needed to be corrected. The prince thought that he needed a special herb that had incredibly strong yin energy. He ordered his organs to think, while they noticed that there were no brains among them. Suddenly, the prince was able to remember a place, after which he instantly ordered a carriage to be prepared for him. The protagonist was well aware that almost everything is in the Imperial vault, which can only enter the emperor himself, and permission will be very difficult to obtain. The protagonist moved in the carriage thinking that the emperor would definitely help. He was the crown prince after all. At that time, the guard stood near the emperor's office, where the prince had arrived and greeted his father. The emperor asked why the boy had come to him at such a late hour, and the prince said that he had a very good reason. The protagonist said that he needed permission to visit a secret vault. The emperor asked why the prince needed the vault, while the protagonist sighed very heavily, and then he told him that a very sick noblewoman had appeared in his hospital, and the king couldn't understand how the patient was connected to the vault, while the prince immediately explained that the vault could hold the ingredients he needed. The emperor said that he could not be sure, for the prince might just be hiding behind the patient to enter the vault for his own good. The emperor thought at the time that this was the first time his son had ever spoken to him, which made him smile. The prince was a little angry because he could see the emperor enjoying himself. The prince started yelling that they had no time at all, and at this very moment the patient was on the verge of life and death. The emperor asked where is the prince's proof that his diagnosis is correct. He said that he never studied, he was sick and spent his entire youth on the bed. The emperor stated that he was not sure if the prince was competent in this matter. The protagonist understood perfectly well that the emperor was going to test him, and then he asked if his arguments were true, and the emperor said with a smile on his face that this was the case. The emperor asked to diagnose the knight commander who had recently fallen ill. A short while later, the prince held the man's hand while the emperor watched closely. The emperor was well aware that the prince would not be able to cope because only 3 people knew about the man's illness, including himself. At that time, the prince turned to the commander and announced that he was suffering from baldness, which instantly shocked both the emperor and the man himself. For a while there was an awkward pause between them. The silence was broken by the emperor, who stated that the man's head was clearly showing hair and the prince was talking nonsense, while the protagonist deftly removed the man's wig, saying that it was not real hair. Tears began to form in the man's eyes as he thought about how the prince and the emperor had been too cruel to him. The man was indeed almost completely bald, and just as heartbroken that his secret had been found out. Eventually the prince started to walk away, turning to his bodyguard, leaving the crying man and the shocked emperor. Daman assumed that the prince had been too harsh on the man, but the man said it was okay, because sooner or later he was going to cure his baldness. Suddenly the boys stopped and the prince said with a smile on his face that they had arrived at the right place. In front of them were huge doors that released mana. This was the treasure house. While the man was crying, for the king had not asked the prince to cure his baldness. One of the guards of the place started to approach the prince. After that he was given a strange object right in his hands, which was actually a pass to the vault. It turns out that without this thing in the vault the protective magic was activated. Also the knight told that if the guys will be in the vault for too long, they will definitely die. It turns out that the guys were allowed to be in the vault until dawn. Such a shocked the prince because before dawn is only a few hours. The prince and Daman hurried and began to run towards the door, as suddenly the knight shouted that the prince would stop because it was a zone of a completely different level. It turned out the vault was divided into 3 zones, namely advanced where the hero was trying to get, the middle and basic. The prince started talking about how he didn't know it was the wrong vault, but he was actually angry that the knight didn't fall for his deception. It turns out the emperor had allowed the protagonist to visit the base level area, which surprised the prince a bit, who seemed to be expecting something different. The prince was unhappy with what he got, and he didn't hide it at all, saying that he tried hard during the test. But the king noticed the fact that the prince didn't seem to be trying at all. The prince started talking about the fact that only after the test the emperor started talking about the fact that he was allowed to enter only the base vault, which caused the emperor to think that the prince had no conscience at all. The protagonist began to move towards the right door while thinking about how stingy the Emperor really was. The protagonist applied the pass thinking that he would no longer appeal to the Emperor, after which the pass was successfully activated and the doors opened in front of the protagonist and the knight said that they could now pass through. The prince along with Daman found themselves inside the treasury, after which the protagonist declared that he was in this place of work for the whole night. While the time was ticking and kept going, the protagonist stated that they urgently needed to find the right item, while the guy didn't realize how they would do it. The protagonist said that they needed to find a cold object, absolutely any object. The protagonist said that if the guy could find the right item, he should write down its location and let him know later. Eventually the prince said that they would divide the area into several areas and explore. The protagonist looked carefully in all corners. Daman also scrutinized the items that were in the area. The prince continued his search while time continued to tick away. The prince was frustrated as he hadn't been able to find any of the items he was looking for and he hoped Daman was doing better. While the boy was looking at something intently, the prince asked if the guy had written down the location and the guy said he had done just that. The protagonist looked at the piece of paper and couldn't understand what was written there. Time was running out and the guys really had to hurry. The guys moved towards the right thing. Then they saw 10,000 years of snow. The protagonist thought about the fact that this thing resembled a pager button which is given out in cafes. The protagonist noticed that the shield would break and they would be able to get ice shards that would consist of pure mana. The protagonist touched this artifact, then thought about the fact that the ice shield would appear as soon as he invested his mana. The guy started to fill the artifact with his magic, after which the artifact started to glow brightly. The artifact started to hum very loudly, which made the prince think that not much mana was needed. The protagonist tried to do it again, but slower. It seemed to him that it was similar to the way he used to adjust the temperature of the shower in his past life. The prince continued to put his mana into the artifact, and suddenly he succeeded, and a frost shield appeared in front of him. The protagonist was amazed that the shield was really huge, but it also had almost no weight. The prince rejoiced that now he would be able to cure the woman with the help of the cold. The protagonist stated that he would need Daman's help again, but he didn't understand his lord's thoughts at all. The protagonist stated that he would explain all the details later. A while later the knight saw a man in front of him. It was Daman, who looked so, and the knight assumed that they had chosen a sword, which the guy kept on his belt. While the prince who had docked it Daman jumped out, and started to declare that he was completely disappointed in Daman. The protagonist himself was fully dressed in a huge amount of artifacts, and the knight asked the guy to also take off everything he was wearing. At that time in the palace the morning began to come. Suddenly the doctor began to wake up and heard strange noises outside the window. He began to look out the window and saw the prince who was standing next to Daman. The doctor seemed pleased that the prince was traveling with Daman. The doctor thought the guy was doing a great job protecting the protagonist. The doctor was incredibly happy that the prince had found such a good friend. He was beginning to think that he could definitely start to trust Daman a little. The sun started to rise from under the mountains, while the prince activated his shield and Daman started to draw his blade. Then the guy jumped up from his seat, and with all his might struck his sword right on the shield that the prince had created. The dishes instantly began to fall, and the doctor screamed in horror that Daman, whom he had mentally praised a moment ago, had turned out to be the real traitor. A few minutes ago the prince had asked Daman to listen carefully to what he was going to tell him. The boy thought that the prince had a really pure heart to sincerely help the patients, and also thought that he would be happy to help in any way he could. With a smile on his face, the protagonist asked his subordinate with all his might to strike him with his sword. This instantly broke Daman's mind, as only a true madman could ask for such a thing. The hero explained that the guy would have to strike until his shield broke. Daman's respect for the protagonist instantly dropped, and it was at that moment that the doctor woke up, hearing voices outside. Daman assumed that the prince wanted to make him look like a traitor and kill him, but the hero explained that they needed the shield to save the patient. The prince started claiming that it would end up helping both him and the prince himself, which didn't explain anything at all to the guy. The protagonist asked if the guy had seen the description of the artifact, but he still didn't understand what he was talking about, so Daman said that the prince could just put the artifact on the ground, and the prince explained that it wouldn't work that way and activated the shield. He explained that for the shield to work he had to keep pouring magic into it, and Daman suggested that he needed to break the shield and not hurt the prince. That's what the prince wanted from his subordinate. Daman began to explain that such a thing could be considered treason and he simply could not do it, and then stated that he could only do such a thing if he was paid well. The guy stated that he wanted to get bonuses for every hit he made. The prince was surprised that the guy planned to get money for hitting his master. The guy then put his hand on his chest and then stated that he considered the prince a benefactor and respected him a lot for helping other people without fail, but this was a job that he had to get paid for. While the prince looked closely at the guy, the protagonist was well aware of Damon's misfortunes in life. He believed that it wasn't all due to lack of money, and even in the novel itself he was surprisingly poor. The protagonist started smiling. While the doctor was approaching the guys, the protagonist started talking about how shameless the guy was. Then the sun started to rise in the sky and the protagonist activated his shield, promising to pay Daman for every strike he made. Then the guy started pulling out his sword, hoping that the money from the prince would come in time. Daman struck the shield incredibly hard, while the dishes flew into the sky, and the doctor screamed in horror that Daman was the real traitor. The doctor instantly began to lose consciousness from the stress he had just experienced, while the shield was able to withstand Damon's attack with ease. The boy was about to try again, putting even more force into the blow, while the prince grimaced his face, expecting to receive another incredibly weighty blow. Daman was surprised that the prince was acting this way because he hadn't even swung yet, and then the guy threw another hard punch right at the shield. He ended up throwing a huge series of punches aimed at the shield, but the shield was still completely unharmed, while the guy assumed he needed to hit even harder to the prince's cries that he was just trying to get more money by throwing more punches. The guy finally decided to be as serious as possible and hit with all his might, and in an instant he struck incredibly hard with his sword, causing the shield to crack at the point of contact with the sword, and then the shield shattered into a huge number of small pieces, which instantly brought a smile to the prince's face. The prince was overjoyed that Daman was able to handle the shield. Then the prince turned around and said that they had to collect all the fragments, but suddenly they saw the doctor sleeping on the floor. The protagonist had gathered the ingredients for the usual tonic soup and was standing over a pot of boiling medicine. The prince then decided to add the shield fragment, and as a result the protagonist was able to improve the effectiveness of the medicine. The heart offered the protagonist to test the effects of the potion, and he instantly agreed to see what it could do. The ability gave a detailed description of what the potion did, which made the prince happy because now he didn't have to personally try the medicine. The prince was sure that now he would be able to save the woman, so he and his knight went to the room of the patient. The man rejoiced when he saw the protagonist. Then the prince asked about the woman's condition, and it turned out that she was still lying in bed. The prince realized that the woman's energy level had dropped even lower and he could only hope for his new medicine. The main character then took a small portion of the medicine into a spoon and began to pour the contents into the girl's mouth a little at a time. Later, the main held a reception with other patients and sometime later closely monitored the condition of the patient. Eventually he continued to brew the medicine, and just 10 days later all the servants just came to the delight. They could not believe that their prince himself created the medicine and personally sings them to the patient, while the doctor thought that he always believed in the prince and never doubted him. Everyone was just delighted with the main character, who at the same moment looked just disgusting, like a real demon. It turns out that the protagonist was completely exhausted. His physical condition was not the best. Suddenly, the system reported that because the prince was admired by others, the effectiveness of the healing fee skill increased by 50%. As a result, the protagonist was able to get 8 days of life, which instantly brought a smile to his face. Now the prince realized that if people around him will admire him, he can easily get a lot more life. The carriage was moving on the ground while the sun was setting over the horizon. The protagonist was inside the carriage with other people, and thought that even though he was able to handle the situation this time, running the clinic alone was becoming more and more difficult. The protagonist realized that he needed professional nurses. Sometime later the carriage stopped and people started to come out of it. The woman began to thank the protagonist for not only curing her illness, but also bringing her home. The prince thought about the fact that he had already received excellent bonuses from the system, and now his number of points was 1500. The protagonist declared that there was no need to thank him, because it was simply enough for him that the woman was healthy. This touched everyone who heard these words, and they could not hold back their tears, after which she tried to say goodbye as suddenly she was stopped by the prince, and then said that he wanted to talk to them seriously. The man was surprised that the prince wanted to discuss something with him, and then he went to the prince's carriage. He didn't understand why they needed to sit and talk like that, and he said that they really needed to do it. The weather was beautiful outside. While the man started to knead his shoulder, he couldn't understand why the prince was silent. While the protagonist sighed heavily and started to massage his shoulder, complaining about being tired. The protagonist began to wiggle and hinted that when he was treating the girl, he was very tired because he hadn't slept much. The man seemed to understand such obvious hints and then began to talk about how he thought about how to repay the prince, and the hero said that he does not take money for treatment. After breaking the man that he can do something else, the protagonist completely rejoiced and said that in the end the man is not his patient, and it is from patience and he does not take money. The man said that the prince was right and anticipated that something unpleasant was about to happen. The protagonist started pulling out huge stacks of papers and then reading the man's information said that he was an artist, and it turned out to be true. The prince said that he wanted the artist to work with him on a project. A few days later in Frontier Square, where there was a huge statue dedicated to Lloyd. Suddenly the man asked if the other guy had heard about the news. It turns out the prince was looking for new workers for his palace. It turns out the old man told the guy because the guy hadn't worked anywhere for 5 years. It turns out the guy had already paid his rent twice, which made the guy instantly change his face and said he really needed to find a job. While the strange girl was looking intently at the apple, she kept holding the apple in her hand and staring intently in his direction. She seemed to have heard the conversation and was a little interested. The prince congratulated the man for becoming a professional artist and asked why the prince's face was so elongated in the paintings. It turns out that one of the paintings depicted the prince in a strange appearance, and in another painting called Life in Threes, the guys looked strange. There was also a painting called Coming Back to You, and Damien looked at the painting where the prince was crying and he had the distinct urge to just cut the painting up. The prince started talking about how it's okay to change the look of the people in the painting a little bit. The main character pointed his hand at the painting, which gathered a huge amount of people, saying that it would help him a lot with publicity. People didn't understand what the picture meant, because most of them came because it was free. Suddenly one of the people paid attention to the sign. The description said that the prince was looking for people for the position of White Angel nurse. As a result, in the place where the main character was accepting applications for the nurse job, there was an incredibly large number of people. A guy was crying, saying in his ear that he would get a great job, while a strange girl was looking carefully at the sheet. The main condition was that the person would be required to live in the Imperial capital. The girl instantly clenched her fist, while the prince himself rejoiced at such a huge number of applicants. The prince had a bright smile on his face, so much so that his mouth began to drool. The prince said that he was really happy. He said that if they could get more talented people, then they would be able to cure more people. Then the protagonist opened his palms and said that he simply couldn't be happy, while thinking that this way he could get more life. Damien thought that the prince really was incredible. Since that moment, exactly 6 days had passed and the girl was moving along the street. A huge number of people gathered in front of the gate. The girl looked carefully at the top, then said in a low voice that she had arrived exactly on time. Suddenly, one of the people grabbed the spoon as a microphone. Then he began to shout that now he will tell about the first test to choose the medical staff. Also, he said that the prince will personally select the best. He pulled the name of the test as he could, continuing to pull incredible intrigue. And in the end he said that the rules will be announced in the next part of this series of videos. I will try to do as soon as possible. The man started talking about the first test for the applicants and then announced that the first test was that all the guys just had to get to the interview. People were a bit disappointed because they thought that the test for such a cool position would be much harder, while one of the palace employees announced that people would be divided into groups of 50 people. It turns out that each group had to run to the main gate, which was a distance of 3 kilometers, and only 10 people from each group will be able to reach the interview. Unexpectedly, Sor asked what would happen to those who couldn't make it into the top 10 groups, and the man said that they would be disqualified. The first group started their race. Everyone ran with all their might. They kept running while the prince along with the doctor watched closely, when suddenly the doctor announced that everyone else was disqualified, because the top 10 had already passed. Those who were able to pass were finally able to relax, and the doctor said that they all did a great job. Then the doctor pointed to a table filled with a huge number of plates with strange contents and said that they would immediately start the next stage. Then it turned out that the guys had to find 6 medical elements on the table, and people immediately started sniffing everything that was on it. The guy also thought very carefully about how to make the right choice, when suddenly one of the test subjects bowed his head, then began to breathe very hard and very hard. For a while there was complete silence. No one seemed to know what to do. All together they began to think about why no one helped the man who had lost consciousness. Suddenly all the participants decided to ignore the man and continue to pass the test because they thought that they did not have time for it. The prince watched carefully and remained silent, then turned towards the doctor, and he immediately started to come out to the people and announced that it was time for the test subjects to stop. The doctor announced that the people who had passed would be notified some time later. And then the guys started to leave, frustrated that they couldn't find the ingredients, while completely ignoring the unconscious man. The prince and the doctor looked towards the man in the cloak, and the prince suddenly addressed him, saying that he was allowed to get up. Turned out to be Daman, who instantly rose to his feet, then began to rejoice that he had managed to get these people through incredibly easily. The prince confessed that he was very worried that the guy's fall would seem too dramatic to people, and then he started to show an incredibly fake fall, after which the prince said that this is how a realistic fall should look like, to which the doctor said that the prince was full of talent, and the guy looked silently in the direction of his lord. Thanks to Daman, the prince was able to evaluate everyone who was taking the test. The prince said with confidence in his eyes that all the test subjects couldn't handle the task. He was trying to say that knowledge could always be gained, which made Daman think that they were testing personal qualities because that was more important. That was exactly the case, and that was the reason the whole group had failed. The second group completely ignored the unconscious man. The third group repeated the experience of the others and ignored him as well. The fourth group was not surprised and ignored the unconscious man as well. The prince fell to the ground thinking that no one cared about the unconscious man. The prince offered Daman to walk, after which they began to walk in an unknown direction. The protagonist was very upset because in the end there were no more candidates, and he could not find a worthy one. Suddenly the prince saw a picture of a girl arguing with a knight, who forbade her passage, because she was not a human. The girl began to shout that she was a human being. The prince was out of his mind with anger, because the knight was communicating so with the candidate, while their number was very small. Suddenly the prince was struck by Daman's words that the girl was a werewolf. The prince said that she had no tail at all, and the boy explained that the tail was just hidden by the cloak. The prince thought in the rumor about the werewolf girl, which made Daman assume that even the prince disliked werewolves. The protagonist thought about the fact that they had the ability to transform, had incredible physical strength, and had the perfect canine sense of smell. So the prince drooled and started yelling that the girl was a nurse. The girl shouted that she was a citizen of the country and also had rights, while the knight continued to forbid her to participate. The girl gritted her teeth at the man's insult, saying that everything he was talking about was just prejudice. The girl shouted that she was normal while the knight continued to provoke her, which made the girl shake with anger, when suddenly the prince ordered the guys to stop the dispute, after which the prince began to scold the knight, because he specified that any resident of the capital can participate in the tests. The girl was shocked when she heard the prince defending her and ordering the knight to apologize to her. The prince apologized to the girl on behalf of the guard, and she also greeted the prince. The protagonist asked if the girl still wanted to complete the task, and she immediately said that she did. Then the prince said that they would start right away, which surprised the girl a bit. The protagonist suggested that the werewolf was very tough, but he also confessed that he had not seen the girl in action at all, and then he said that if the girl could outrun the guardian she would complete the task. The prince said that the first one to reach the fountain and return would win the contest. The girl instantly pulled off her cloak with a smile on her face, after which the prince ordered the guard to get ready, and the latter also undressed and got into a stance for a quick start. They stood near each other while the girl seemed relaxed in front of the guy, who was thinking that he had to win this competition, and even the girl herself did not seem to want to lose because she needed this job. The prince ordered the guys to get ready. The guy looked like a man who would do his best to win, while the girl's eyes were also filled with determination. The protagonist announced the start of the race, and the girl instantly rushed out of her seat and left the guy far behind. The distance between them was unbelievably huge, which made the protagonist really excited. The girl was moving at an incredible speed, and a moment later she was right in front of the fountain, and then jumped from her seat and grabbed a part of the fountain with her hand, and then started spinning at a great speed, and instantly changed direction and ran towards the protagonist. While the guy had not yet reached the fountain, the girl was already running towards the prince. They missed each other. The girl thought about the fact that the guy was incredibly slow, and she was well aware that the victory was definitely hers, while the guy seemed to be sinking into despair. The guy was incredibly angry because he was about to lose this battle, but suddenly his leg twisted, and then he began to roll on the ground at a great speed, taking more damage. The girl heard the guy behind her start screaming in pain. She turned to the other side and assumed that the guy had also hurt his shoulder, but she still kept running. The speed was really great. Suddenly her teeth clenched with anger. Then she instantly changed direction and the floor started to collapse. The girl ran away from the protagonist towards the guy who insulted her a moment ago. While running, the girl was complaining loudly that she wanted to win by a huge margin. The prince was watching carefully what was happening, while the girl was right in front of the guy, then grabbed his hand tightly under the guy's questions what she was going to do. She instantly fixed his shoulder, which was dislocated, after which the whole street heard the scream of the guy, who felt incredible pain. The prince began to approach the girl with the words that he was completely satisfied with her, because that's what he wanted. The prince held out the pendant given to the boy with the words that the girl had been accepted as a nurse. Sometime later it was evening outside and all the boys gathered around the table. The main character held out the contract and asked the girl to familiarize herself with its terms. The girl looked at the contract and said that it looked pretty fancy. The prince stated that they had plenty of time and the girl could feed on the document for as long as she needed. The girl looked intently at the sheet while the prince watched intently. The protagonist believed that the girl had incredible physical abilities and was not lacking in wisdom. The protagonist was also worried because he saw the smile on the girl's face when she was fixing the man's shoulder. The protagonist realized that even though she helped, but intentionally made it as painful as possible, and in the future there will be patients who will not like it. Also, the hero was very sorry that they did not manage to get such people as the girl, while the girl herself put the sheet on the table, and the prince immediately asked how the girl the contract that she had just read. She said with an incredibly serious expression on her face that she would like to add a few points to the contract. The prince was incredibly stunned by the girl's statement and asked what she wanted to add to the contract. She began to tell about who she was, namely the head of the family, which included about 50 people. Hearing this information, at first the prince did not react in any way, but suddenly the prince's face completely sewed from the thought that he can get such as the girl 50 pieces. The protagonist started to say that the girl should have been told about this earlier. The protagonist thought that absolutely no man would give up 50 workers of this level. The girl asked the prince to allow her kin to take the test, as well as the girl said that the prince would help remove the problem that had been bothering all of them since long ago. The protagonist didn't understand what problem she was talking about and assumed that it was a lack of food. But it was not so, and in fact, because of this problem they often found themselves in unpleasant situations. She said that the problem was their own tails. It turned out that their tails moved of their own accord, while the prince wondered if this was a problem. The girl started talking about how they were unable to hide their emotions, and that was a problem, since their emotions were incredibly easy to read. Rogues often tricked them. The girl said that even though they tried to hide the tail under their pants, it was so strong that there was no way to hide it. The protagonist was surprised that they tie their tails to their leg, but even so, the tail still comes loose. The protagonist thought it was like a muscle that had a life of its own. The prince suggested that they could just cut off the tail, but the girl told him that without the tail they couldn't move or live normally. She also said that their tails grow back in a month anyway. Suddenly the main character got an idea, or rather the idea that the girl asked him to deal with this problem. The protagonist was in despair because he had never treated tails before. The prince had no idea what he should do in this difficult situation. The prince offered an alternative because he could become a protector in society. He said that he could use his title and power to support their family. The girl instantly refused this offer. She began to say that this way they could not solve the main problem. She said that in this case, if something happened to the prince, everything could become even worse. She began to say that she needed more than a temporary solution to the problem. The prince realized that she was demanding that he get rid of the problem completely. The protagonist said that he fully understood the girl's demand, and she asked if the prince would help her. The protagonist said that he would really help and honestly confessed that so far he had no ideas about it at all. The girl was amazed at how honest the main character was. She also thought that if the prince was the kind of person who would only help in words, she would be very disappointed. The girl got up from the couch and said that she was going to leave and would wait for news from the protagonist. The protagonist asked the girl to stay in the palace, after which the room was completely silent as the girl left. The protagonist didn't know what to do because he couldn't miss these incredible workers. He just couldn't imagine what he could do with intelligent muscles. It seemed that the prince had no ideas at all, and he sighed heavily. Sometime later the prince started to look terrible. He didn't seem to sleep or eat at all. It turned out that all this time he was looking for some information that could help him, but in the end he couldn't find anything. While the doctor started shouting at the prince, which made him scared again, and he assumed that the doctor was scaring him on purpose. The doctor began to say that if the stress in the prince's body accumulates, he might get sick, while the protagonist said that if the doctor continues to scare him, he will definitely get sick. The doctor said that if the guy frowns, he will get wrinkles, and then began to ask the prince to stop frowning because you can't get rid of wrinkles. The prince started smiling after these words from the doctor. He realized that the doctor was just trying to cheer him up. The main character said that wrinkles are not a problem at all, and it can also be solved. The prince began to talk about how there are things that can help with the appearance of wrinkles and also with fighting them. Suddenly an idea popped into the prince's head, and he instantly changed his face. The protagonist thought about Botox being a poison that paralyzes. He thought about the fact that this substance could be used on the tail to make it stop moving. Then he remembered where he met such a poison. The prince finally started to smile. Now he knew exactly how to solve the problem with the tails. The prince asked the doctor to get the poison used by Kuzman, because he knew that the doctor kept this thing. Then the protagonist said that the doctor as soon as possible to bring the poison and took it to Anissa's chambers. At that time the girl was doing push-ups very furiously on the mole, as suddenly she heard a knock at her door, after which she asked what brought the prince at such a late hour. The protagonist began to lead Anissa in an unknown direction and said that he might have thought of a solution to her problem. The prince thought that he had two things left to decide, namely the place where the procedure would take place. Sometime later the guy touched the girl's back and then he could see her body completely. It turned out that Anissa's body had a different meridian arrangement which was quite different from the human one. The acupuncture points were also very different from human ones, as well as a new vessel that leads to the tail. The protagonist decided that Anissa was human enough for him to do something. So the prince asked the girl to turn into a wolf, which surprised her a bit. It turned out the location of the dots would change after the transformation, and the protagonist needed to know that. The girl silently nodded her head. Then she began to breathe very slowly, and just a moment later her body began to change. Her legs began to turn into huge paws, and she turned into a humanoid huge wolf. The prince was surprised that the girl did not grow as much as he expected, then confessed that she looked like a dog, which seemed to make Anissa a little angry. The protagonist also realized that the girl lost her ability to speak, because now she has a completely different mouth structure. Then he asked him to give him a paw and the girl was a wolf. A while later the guy made her roll on the floor like a real dog with one word. The doctor was completely shattered but still kept smiling looking at such a strange picture. A while later the prince was sitting in his office thinking that he was able to find out one necessary detail, but the problem was that he simply did not know the right amount of paralyzing poison to use on the girl. Now the prince needed to know the ingredients of the poison in order to be able to find out the exact dosage that the girl would need. The prince thought that it might be worth asking Kuzman, who was now in prison, but he also realized that this man was not to be trusted at all. The protagonist decided to eat it himself, then put it in the circle of mana and study this drug. So suddenly all of the prince's organs started calling him crazy, and then they stood in a circle. Everyone was shocked that the prince really wanted to poison himself and was thinking about who would detoxify his body. The liver started screaming with all its might because it would be the one to save the body. The protagonist was amazed that his own organs demanded that he give the poison to the little animal. The organs wondered how it was normal for the prince to test the poison on his own body. But suddenly the liver said that there were monsters that were created to analyze the poison. As soon as the protagonist heard this, he realized that such a monster would be incredibly useful to him. The protagonist could not believe the information he had just learned, namely that there was a creature that could analyze ingredients. Suddenly the prince found out that the liver had learned about the creature in the system waiting room, which immediately aroused curiosity in the protagonist. It turned out that before waking up all the organs were in that room and were sound asleep. The protagonist was surprised that in some space all his internal organs were asleep. The prince immediately wondered what the system was all about, but it turned out that the dissemination of this information was strictly forbidden. When the protagonist asked the liver to list the properties of creatures that could help him, the liver simply said that it did not. Suddenly the fish's eyes opened again. Then the fish's body began to recover, and it ripped off one of its teeth. The protagonist watched as the offended fish wrote something on a part of its body. It turned out that the fish was writing about all the ingredients and also about the lethal dose. The protagonist carefully read the contents with a smile on his face. Now the prince was fully confident that he could use the drug to help the girl. The prince turned to his doctor, after which he was instantly on the spot, which looked like a real mystic, as suddenly the doctor saw the fish and was completely shocked that the prince got another such creature. The main character started lying about the fish just coming to him at night, adding that he is definitely popular. The doctor was laughing hysterically. He told the protagonist that he was reminded of a historical figure that was in the books, namely Lloyd. He said that he was a man who lived in the time when the empire was a kingdom and also had similar ghostly beasts. The prince was surprised to hear the descriptions of Lloyd and asked if he was really that great. The doctor began to tell him that it was Lloyd who laid the foundation of their empire and that he was incredibly popular. The prince ordered the doctor to bring the girl, and he instantly started running to fulfill his lord's errand as soon as possible. Sometime later, the sky was incredibly blue outside the window. The girl was moving along the corridor with the doctor. She thought about whether the prince was able to think of something because it had been a short time, and his strength is not unlimited, as suddenly the doctor noticed that Anise is worried, and it is perfectly visible. She was wary, and the doctor said that it can be seen in the face and not in the tail. The doctor was suddenly surprised, and then apologized for his words, because he certainly did not want to offend the girl. She looked at the doctor with a smile on her face. She said that she was used to everyone paying attention to her tail, and reminded him that they had not yet formally introduced themselves to each other, after which they shook hands and introduced themselves. The doctor asked Anise if she minded if he gave her advice. The doctor said that the girl would not be surprised when the prince came up with a cure. She did not understand what the doctor was talking about. The doctor opened the door and warned the girl that as soon as the prince told her about the treatment, she would definitely think that he was crazy. The girl was surprised at such words and could not even imagine what awaited her for the treatment. While the prince with a smile on his face greeted Anise, then the prince asked the girl to sit down and she went towards the bed. After she sat on the bed, she was surprised that the prince had only one day to come up with the treatment. The prince said that it was, and he had already come up with the right treatment, so he asked the girl not to worry. Anise asked if the prince would tell her what the treatment would be, while the prince realized that the girl was worried and said that he would tell her now. The prince showed the needle and said that he will pierce the girl's tail several times with it. Then the prince, with the same smile on his face, said that he will inject the poison into the girl's body. The protagonist was glowing with happiness, while his servants seemed just as mad and thought this treatment was genius and clapped for him. The girl immediately looked towards the doctor. She seemed a little shocked, while the doctor smiled very warmly, as if to say that the girl should trust the prince unconditionally. Other people looked the same way, as if asking to believe the protagonist, and the prince himself was not particularly different from them. The girl was just shocked after what she saw. She realized that the madman in this place was not only the prince, and all the others present. The girl sat with her head bowed in front of the main character. She seemed to be thinking furiously about something, while the prince said that she didn't need to think much, but just trusted him. The girl thought that the prince didn't look like a very reliable person, but she decided to trust him because if they could get rid of their problem, life would be much easier. Anise decided to take a risk and said that she was ready for what the prince was going to do. Then the protagonist ordered his men to get started, and they immediately started carrying a strange cloth towards Anise. She had no time to react before she was covered with the cloth and ended up on the bed facing the pillow with only her tail visible above the blanket. The protagonist prepared to proceed, and then with an incredibly confident expression said that he was beginning the treatment. All the servants admired the prince. They thought he looked incredibly cool at this moment, while the protagonist touched the girl's body and began to infuse his mana. He began to examine the girl from the inside. The protagonist thought about the fact that although acupuncture points existed, no medicine could prove them, while he, thanks to the existence of magic, was finally able to prove that these points were real. The protagonist was about to start the procedure and grabbed one of his needles. Then the guy pierced the first point with the needle and took out some poison, which caused his mana to turn a different color and began to penetrate into the girl's body. Suddenly she felt something and twitched. The protagonist in turn continued the procedure, so the prince continued to pierce the girl's body with needles and inject the poison. The protagonist was finally able to make the tail weaken, but he was well aware that it was not enough to paralyze it. He wanted to keep the effect until the end, but suddenly the tail was able to recover and began to interfere with the procedure. The protagonist thought that he was fully prepared for such a thing. Then he decided to speed up and started using the needles with renewed vigor, and finally the last needle on the girl's neck was stuck. Anise was mad with anger because she asked to deal with her tail and the guy pierced the back of her head. Suddenly her tail started to shake. Then it suddenly finally fell down. The girl started to wiggle her toe. It continued to wiggle, while the prince shouted happily that he was finally done. The protagonist said that the girl could finally relax. The girl got to her feet after the guy's words that the procedure was completely over. Anise thought about the fact that the procedure took very little time. Everything happened too fast. Suddenly the girl turned her attention to the tail. Suddenly she realized that the tail was not reacting to her mental state at all. The protagonist said that he was able to trick the nerves in the girl's body and paralyze the tail. He said that he redirected the nerve endings of the tail to the little finger, which would now move instead. The protagonist started talking about how the girl's pinky finger was now a tail, and it was magic to the applause of all the palace workers. The girl sat silently on the bed. It seemed that she wanted to say something, as suddenly he began to cry a lot. Because of what on the face of the prince appeared a soft smile. He realized that now the sadness and contempt with which she faced did not matter at all. The girl sincerely thanked the protagonist for what he had done. The prince asked to stop with gratitude and start the process of signing the contract. The protagonist also reminded that the girl had promised to bring others for helping her with her tail, and the prince asked the girl to sign the contract with a very insistent expression. She had changed her face, but she had just been grateful to him. Sometime later from the palace of the main character heard his very loud laughter. It turned out the prince was laughing seeing the huge number of tails in his palace. The doctor asked whether the prince is very happy, and he immediately replied that he was incredibly happy. He thought that he managed to get as many as 50 medical staff S rank who were very hard at work. The protagonist smiled with joy and thought that the work would be much better now. He taught them basic nursing and emergency care techniques as well as nursing. He also taught them how to make bandages and medicines. Now the clinic could fully function. The girl told the prince that they had created a new shift schedule, after which the protagonist began to rejoice. The prince's mind conjured up an image of his clinic working around the clock like a real conveyor belt to treat people. He also assumed that all the guys had gotten used to their little fingers. Then the prince began to think that the situation was perfect. Suddenly the system told him that the hero would not get life days because he had not increased the life expectancy of 50 patients, but also the organs applauded the prince for what he had done. Suddenly one of the new organs began its awakening, and it turned out to be the stomach, which opened its eyes. It instantly started screaming that it wanted to eat a fried pork cutlet. He also had a huge belly, and then began to demand absolutely any tasty food. It seemed that he could devour everything. The stomach began to shout with all its might that he was losing consciousness and he needed to eat as soon as possible, while the prince was amazed that the stomach demanded such food, which simply does not exist in this world. The protagonist also wanted Korean food, but in fact he and his stomach could only dream of it. The protagonist mentally asked the stomach to be patient for a while, and the stomach demanded a sweet, after which the protagonist accepted the sweet. The stomach gave the protagonist 300 points and the other organs another 700 points, making the prince's balance 1,000. The protagonist was well aware that the organs would now be able to give information to the stomach. Suddenly the protagonist saw a notification that his mana core had improved due to a procedure he had performed. The amount of mana his circle could store had increased by 150%. The circle had also begun to expand and now had more storage space inside it. The prince was very happy that he was able to get such a huge amount of points, but suddenly one of the nurses reported to the prince that one of the patients looked very strange. It turns out that the patient's body had a very different odor and a very high fever. After these words, the protagonist decided to look at him personally. Sometime later a man was sitting at the table and counting something very carefully. It turned out that the man's name was Pavard and he was the head butler of the place. Suddenly after finishing the calculations he suggested that his eyes might be deceiving him. He began to scrutinize the document not believing what he had just learned. His hands began to shake. Then he instantly dropped the document on the table and with a desperate expression screamed that they were in a complete mess. The man instantly started running to the protagonist's room. Once inside he screamed calling out for the prince. While the protagonist was frightened by this sudden visit and Damien prepared to fight. The prince realized that it was his butler and was surprised by his visit. The protagonist assumed that the man was not feeling well, but he said that he had an incredibly important thing to tell him. After these words, the butler leaned near the protagonist and began to speak very quietly. The protagonist was in complete shock as soon as he learned that the budget of their palace is about to completely end. The prince jumped up from his seat amazed that they were running out of money. and he was the crown prince. The protagonist knew that if they didn't have any money, then the clinic was out of the question. The protagonist immediately asked where all their money had gone. The man said that last year the prince had cut the palace's budget, which shocked the protagonist. The prince was angry at the previous owner of the body. A while later the prince and the man were sitting in front of each other, and the man said that the prince may have made this decision because he felt that he wouldn't live long. The main character suggested that he had given up in the past. It turned out that the character had moved 2 days out of 10, and there was a lot of extra money left in the palace. The prince was quite upset, saying that the mistakes of the past were still haunting him. The man also said with a smile on his face that the protagonist was able to become much healthier compared to how he looked last year. The protagonist, on the other hand, still felt terribly sad, saying that he was definitely not happy in this horrible world. The prince had a broken expression on his face, saying that he couldn't be happy about anything if he didn't even have a penny in his pocket. Suddenly the protagonist was angry that all the problems in his life were caused by a lack of money. Suddenly he thought about who the previous owner of the body was, namely the real Rachel. He thought that he understood Rachel a little, because he was definitely desperate. Suddenly the protagonist had an idea. He suggested that they could just ask for more money to maintain the palace. But the protagonist's hopes were instantly dashed by the butler's words that this was simply impossible. The main character said that without money they would have to close the clinic, and he would simply die. It turns out that according to the laws of the empire, budget for a particular year should be requested only at the end of the previous year, and the only person who was not limited by this law was the emperor himself. In the eyes of the prince finally appeared hope, and then he immediately went by carriage in the direction of his father's castle. But in the evening of the same day he quickly began to go home because his father did not want to help, after which the protagonist sat at the table and very sad. He thought that he just cannot allow that the clinic closed because of money. Just like in his previous life, the protagonist thought that he had one last option to solve this problem. The prince asked if the butler had a list of the palace's assets, and the butler said that of course he had a list. The protagonist asked to bring the list to him, which caused the butler not to understand, as suddenly the protagonist made a creepy face and said that he was going to sell all their property. He thought of selling paintings, statues, silver and gold watches. The butler cried looking at the painting that was being sold. He begged the protagonist to change his mind, while the prince himself was unbowed. The butler started to run away in tears, shouting that he just hates the prince. From that moment a few days passed and the butler again appeared before the prince. The protagonist asked everyone to listen carefully. He said that although they were able to get some money, it was only a temporary solution to the problem. Damien suggested that the prince had already started preparing for the next step, while the butler continued to cry over the sold items. The protagonist started talking about how they needed to create a stable fund of money, while the butler stated that they simply didn't have anything else to sell, and the prince stated that they would make their own medicine and sell it. The protagonist, with a smile on his face, said that from now on he would be the crown prince who would sell the medicine. Thank you very much for watching this video to the end. Really saved Oishiro Yerida, as well as I want to thank all the commenters of the video. It is thanks to the fact that you write comments I continue to publish videos. Thank you guys. Thank you all. See you soon.